Story 1: The Ink That Measured Trust. You sit at a long wooden bench in the dim light of a late afternoon in Florence, sometime in the 14th century. The streets outside smell faintly of wool dye and baked bread, but inside this counting house, the air is thick with the dust of parchment and the sharp tang of iron gall ink. The ink is made from oak galls, wine, and a bit of iron sulfate, a recipe known to clerks and scribes across Europe. It is black, almost blue when fresh, but it will fade to a dull brown over decades. In these ledgers, the fatting of ink is not merely a natural process. It is a kind of slow erasure of memory, a reminder that even the most careful accounting will one day become a ghost. The ledger before you is thick and bound in leather, its edges uneven, its spine cracked from years of handling. To the untrained eye, it appears as a simple record of numbers, dates, and names. But to a merchant banker of Florence in the late medieval period, it is a living thing, a tool of memory, a weapon of competition, and a guardian of trust. The marks upon it are not idle. They are contracts, obligations, and records of promises made across continents. Before double entry bookkeeping became the quiet standard of European finance, merchants recorded transactions in a jumble of notes, tallies, and private marks. Errors were frequent, fraud was common, and disputes over memory could last for years. What the Florentines developed, and what Venetian merchants later perfected, was not just a method for recording debt and credit, but a way of thinking about money as a system. Every transaction was mirrored. If one account showed a credit, another showed a debit. The ledger was no longer just a diary of business. It became a balanced scale, a mathematical reflection of reality. To modern eyes, the idea is so basic it almost seems inevitable. But in a world where numeracy was uneven and literacy still largely the domain of clerics, the discipline of balancing a book was revolutionary. It allowed merchants to see their business as a whole, to track not only what they had, but what they owed. It turned the abstract idea of trust, the willingness to believe that someone would pay you later, into something that could be written down, reviewed, and calculated. Florentine bankers used two main books, the Memorial and the Giornal. The Memorial was the rough notebook where transactions were recorded as they happened, often messy, written in haste, with ink stains and abbreviations only the clerk himself could decipher. Later, these notes would be transferred to the Giornal, the daybook, where each transaction was rewritten neatly in chronological order. From there, the entries would move once more into the Libro Mastro, the master ledger, where they would be sorted by account and balanced according to the rules of double entry. The process was slow, deliberate, and almost meditative. In a counting house like this, the work never truly ended. A merchant might have loans in Barcelona, wool shipments bound for London, spices arriving from Alexandria, and debts owed by nobles who saw little shame in paying late. Every coin had its journey, and every journey had to be recorded. You would note not only the amount but also the form. Was it in florins, ducats, or marks of silver? Was the payment in cash, or in kind, such as wool bales or barrels of wine? Was it subject to a future adjustment due to currency fluctuations? These were not idle details. A small error in currency conversion could destroy a deal's profit. And then there was the matter of language. The accounts were written not in Latin, the language of church and law, but in vernacular Italian, sprinkled with commercial abbreviations and symbols that would baffle an outsider. This was the private language of bankers, a code of trust. To write in this way was to declare yourself part of a brotherhood of commerce, a fraternity bound not by blood, but by ledger lines. The double entry system also changed how merchants thought about time. Debt was not a static thing. It had a lifespan. A payment due in 30 days was a future event, a promise not yet fulfilled. The ledger became a map of time as much as a record of money. In a sense, it was an early attempt to predict the future, to know, in ink, what the world would look like weeks or months from now. Yet this was no abstract academic pursuit. Mistakes could ruin families. A misrecorded payment might lead to a false accusation of default. A misplaced decimal could turn profit into loss. To be a clerk in this environment was to live with a constant, low hum of anxiety and vigilance that never slept. There is something almost hypnotic about the routine. The scratch of the quill, the measured blot of ink, the careful shaping of each figure. The work required patience, precision, and the ability to think in two directions at once, to know that every entry here had a mirror elsewhere. You could not simply write a number. You had to understand its twin. The Florentines did not invent the idea from nothing. Historians trace the roots of double entry to earlier Islamic and Byzantine accounting practices, and possibly to the merchants of medieval India. But in Florence, the system took on a distinct form, tied to the rhythms of European trade and to the particular pressures of city-state politics. Florence in the 14th century was not just a place of art and architecture. It was a crucible of financial innovation, driven by the need to manage risk in a world where single bad harvest or a war between kings could upend entire markets. Sitting here, you begin to notice how much the ink itself matters. A darker ink might signify a settled debt. A lighter, faded line might suggest an old obligation, still lingering. Margins are filled with small notes, reminders, calculations, or warnings. Sometimes, a debt is crossed out not because it was paid, but because it was forgiven. Such entries are rare, and they tell their own quiet stories of alliances, favors, and debts that were better left uncollected. And always there is the sense that you are not just writing numbers. You are shaping the story of a business, a family, perhaps even a city. The ledger is both public and private, shown to partners and auditors, but ultimately kept under lock and key. It is a record of who can be trusted, who must be watched, and who should be avoided altogether. The sun is setting outside now, and the candle flames cast long shadows across the pages. You close the memorial, setting it aside for tomorrow's careful transfer into the giorno. The ink on your fingers will linger through the night. You wonder, as you often do, not about the numbers themselves, but about the men behind them. How many of these debts will be paid? How many will be quietly erased? And when you turn these notes into their final form, what story will they truly tell? The next morning, the counting house is awake long before the bells of Santa Maria del Fiore begin their call. In Florence, business starts early, partly to avoid the heat and bustle of midday, but also because letters of exchange arrive with the dawn couriers. These letters are not written for beauty. They are practical tools, short in style, deliberate in tone, and heavy with consequence. In a few lines of cramped handwriting, a merchant in Bruges might transfer the promise of payment to a partner in Pisa, with instructions to adjust for currency, date, and recipient. The practice seems simple. A merchant in one city writes a note instructing another merchant in a different city to pay someone on his behalf. But in the world of 14th century banking, such letters were not just paper. They were vessels of trust, carrying obligations over mountains, through stormy seas, and across political borders. They replaced the dangerous transport of heavy coin and allowed trade to move faster than armies. To the banker, each letter of exchange is a line in the ledger. In the giorno, it appears first as a debit in one account and a credit in another. It might read, to Piero di Marco, for payment to Jacopo in Pisa, Florence 20. In the Libro Mastro, it will be copied under Piero's name, with a balancing entry elsewhere. The system ensures that at the end of the day, all debts and credits match, every number anchored by its equal and opposite. It is the mathematical equivalent of a moral principle. Nothing exists without its counterweight. Florentine banking houses often had multiple branches scattered across Europe, each run by a trusted partner or family member. These branches would communicate through coded letters, both to protect trade secrets and to hide sensitive financial details from prying eyes, rival merchants, envious officials, or the occasional bandit who happened to seize the wrong packet of correspondence. The ciphers were basic compared to modern codes, often just the swapping of certain numbers for letters, or the use of agreed-upon symbols for currency. Still, they slowed the curious, and sometimes that was enough. Behind these calculations lay an ever-shifting problem: Currency conversion. The florin, minted in Florence with a fixed weight of gold, was one of the most trusted coins in Europe, but it was far from the only one in circulation. Venetian ducats, English nobles, French écus, and countless regional silver coins all competed for space in a merchant's strongbox. Exchange rates were in constant motion, changing with the seasons, the harvests, and the wars. A banker's skill lay not only in tracking today's value, but in anticipating tomorrow's, a task made harder by the lack of standard information. News traveled by word of mouth, carried in the memory of sailors, pilgrims, and traders. In the ledger, these exchanges were recorded with maddening precision. A transaction might note that 20 ducats were worth 27 florins and 4 soldi on the date of agreement, but that the actual settlement was to be made 3 months later, using the rate then in effect. The delay created an opening for profit or disaster. In effect, bankers were gambling on the future stability of foreign markets every time they signed such an agreement. The double entry system did something subtle but important. It allowed a merchant to see all these moving pieces at once. Without it, debts could pile unnoticed, hidden behind the illusion of incoming payments. With it, the numbers spoke more plainly. A sudden imbalance could signal trouble, perhaps a partner delaying payment, or a debtor unable to meet his obligations. A cautious banker could react early, tightening credit, selling goods, or calling in loans before the trouble spread. Florentine banking was not only about trade in goods. Increasingly, it was about financing political power. City-states, kings, and even the papacy relied on merchant bankers to fund wars, build cathedrals, and maintain armies. The Medici, the Bardi, the Peruzzi, all names that carried weight in both the marketplace and the council chamber, lent vast sums to rulers. The ledgers of these families were as much political documents as financial ones. Such loans could be ruinous. When Edward III of England defaulted in 1345 on debts owed to the Bardi and Peruzzi banks, debts that financed his campaigns in the 100 Years' War, it sent shockwaves through Florence's economy. The double entry books recorded the default as neatly as any other transaction, one column reduced, another marked with loss. But behind that clean handwriting lay years of strained negotiations, diplomatic appeals, and the quiet knowledge that no calculation could force a king to pay. The counting house was not immune to the human side of its business. For all the talk of precision and balance, the work depended on relationships sometimes warm, sometimes tense, often fragile. Partnerships could dissolve in a single dispute. A trusted clerk could embezzle years' worth of earnings before being discovered. And yet, the daily work continued, because to stop writing in the ledger was to invite chaos. You imagine the clerk at his bench, perhaps Matteo, with his neat hand and cautious eyes carefully rewriting yesterday's memorial into the giorno. He pauses now and then to sharpen his quill, or to consult with the senior partner about an unclear entry. At the far end of the room, an apprentice practices forming numerals, his wax tablet filled with rows of 5s and 7s. The air smells faintly of beeswax from the candles and of damp wool from a merchant's cloak drying on the rack. The process is repetitive, but that is its strength. Repetition reduces error. It allows the mind to find patterns, to sense when something is wrong. A missing entry, a figure that doesn't match, a name in the wrong place, these things stand out more sharply against the rhythm of correct entries. Over time, the banker becomes a kind of historian of commerce, able to trace the life of a loan or the journey of a shipment simply by running a finger down the neat columns of ink. And yet even the best system cannot eliminate risk. Sometimes the danger is obvious. A ship overdue from Alexandria, a debtor whose shop has gone dark, a war blocking the Alpine passes. Other times it is hidden in the numbers themselves, a slow drift in the exchange rate, an accumulation of small debts that, taken together, threaten to sink the whole enterprise. The double entry system offers a warning, but only if someone is watching closely enough to read it. By midday, the room grows warm, and the talk turns to the day's settlements. A messenger from Pisa has arrived with news of a delayed payment, the result of a dispute over wool quality. The senior partner frowns, makes a note, and gives instructions for a letter to be drafted. It will travel north with the next courier, crossing rivers and borders in the hope that it will reach the right desk in time to prevent further loss. The truth is that the ledger is less about exact truth than about agreed-upon truth. The numbers mean what both sides have agreed they mean. A florin recorded here is only as good as the willingness of someone elsewhere to honor it. The ink preserves the agreement, but the agreement itself rests on something more fragile: human reputation. In the quiet that follows the messenger's departure, you think again about the elegance of the system. Two sides, always in balance. But what happens when trust itself, the invisible substance behind every number, begins to erode? Can even the neatest book withstand that kind of imbalance? The candles burn low in the counting house now, though the work continues. In Florence, the days are divided between public trade and private reckoning. By late afternoon, the noise of the marketplace fades, leaving only the quiet shuffling of parchment and the faint scraping of quills. This is when the libro mastro takes center stage, the master ledger, the final and most authoritative record of a merchant's affairs. The master ledger is not a casual document. Its pages are thick, made of durable parchment, resistant to the wear of constant handling. The ink here must be steady, deliberate, without the blots and crossings out that might be forgiven in the memorial or even in the giorno. Once an entry is copied here, it becomes part of the official story of the business. Disputes may be settled by its contents. Partnerships may rise or fall on its accuracy. In some cases, courts will accept it as evidence. This book is, in a very real sense, the voice of the banker himself. In the Florentine system, each account in the master ledger is a self-contained story. A noble client may have dozens of entries over the course of years: loans taken, repayments made, shipments financed, debts forgiven. The double entry method ensures that each credit is matched by a debit somewhere else, perhaps in the account of another merchant, perhaps in the cash on hand page, or perhaps in the account of a foreign partner. To an outsider, these paired numbers might seem abstract. To the banker, they are the residue of real events: a meeting over wine, a handshake in the marketplace, a sealed contract on a summer afternoon. The end-of-year balancing is both a test and a ritual. In the weeks before Christmas, every entry is reviewed, every account summed, every total carried over to a new page for the coming year. This process forces a reckoning not only with the numbers, but with the relationships behind them. A debt that has lingered unpaid for too long must be addressed, either renewed, pursued, or abandoned. A profit that looks solid on paper must be judged against the risks that produced it. And always, there is the question of what to do with the surplus: reinvest in trade, lend to the city, or perhaps hold in reserve for the uncertainties of the new year. Florentine bankers were keenly aware that stability was an illusion. Political unrest, disease, or sudden shifts in trade routes could undo years of careful work. The Black Death had taught them that in the starkest terms. In the late 1340s, as plague emptied the streets and silenced the workshops, countless debts went uncollected. Some were forgiven in the hope of mercy. Others were simply written off, the ink standing as the only reminder of a promise that death had erased. In the master ledgers of those years, you can see the plague's mark: pages with fewer entries, abrupt endings to long-standing accounts, margins filled with small crosses or the Latin obiit, "he died." And yet, even in those years, the work did not stop. The very fact that the system could endure such shocks was proof of its value. The ledger was not just a record of commerce. It was a structure for survival. A merchant who kept his books carefully could recover faster, rebuild partnerships, and re-enter trade with confidence. Those who neglected their records often found themselves adrift, unable to prove what was owed or to whom. In this final stage of the process, the master ledger also served as a map for the future. Patterns emerged in its pages: which clients paid promptly, which markets yielded steady profit, which routes were prone to delay. A skilled banker could read these signs and adjust his strategy accordingly. The ledger did not predict the future, but it narrowed its possibilities. It allowed the banker to act not on hope alone, but on a foundation of measured experience. The language of the ledger, the particular blend of vernacular Italian, Latin phrases, and symbolic shorthand, reinforced its role as a tool for insiders. To those within the trade, the abbreviations and symbols were second nature. A flourish of the pen might indicate a settled account. A dot above a numeral might signify a partial payment. A small mark in the margin might warn of a risky debtor. To those outside the trade, the same marks would be meaningless. This opacity was intentional. The ledger was both an open record and a guarded secret. Florentine banking families treated their ledgers as part of the family inheritance. When a senior partner died, the books would pass to his heirs along with the business itself. In some cases, these inherited ledgers contained decades of continuous records, allowing a grandson to trace a debt or investment begun by his grandfather. This continuity gave the family a kind of economic memory far beyond that of any single individual. It also created a quiet pressure to keep the book worthy of its predecessors, to avoid the shame of disorder or inaccuracy. There is a quiet dignity in imagining such a book heavy, bound in leather darkened by centuries, its pages thick with inked lines that march in orderly columns. The edges might be worn smooth by the touch of generations, the spine creased but unbroken. Here and there, you might find faint fingerprints in the margins, left by some clerk whose hands were still dusty from the counting room. Between the lines of numbers, you might glimpse the outline of a life. A sudden gap where a partner died, a cluster of entries that hint at a rush of opportunity, a slow decline in trade with a distant city as political winds shifted. By the close of the year, the banker has made his final entries. The accounts balance or close enough to suggest competence, if not perfection. The master ledger is set aside, its covers closed with the quiet satisfaction of work completed. Tomorrow, a new book will open, and the process will begin again. And yet, as you look at this closed volume, you can't help but wonder. For all the careful balancing, for all the matched entries and neatly written columns, what happens to the debts that are not recorded? The favors exchanged in confidence, the whispered agreements never put to paper, the quiet understandings that move as much money as any official transaction. These exist outside the ledger's reach, shaping the currents of commerce in ways that no pen can capture. Perhaps the true balance of a banker's life is not in the columns of the master ledger at all, but in the unrecorded accounts that pass from hand to hand, memory to memory, trust to trust. Story 2. A coin worth its weight. You hold a florin in your hand, a small, round disc of gold, no larger than a fingernail, yet heavier than you expect. The year is 1252, and Florence has just begun minting this coin, destined to become one of the most trusted currencies in Europe for nearly 3 centuries. On one side, the city's emblem, the fleur-de-lis, stylized but unmistakable. On the other, the image of Saint John the Baptist, Florence's patron, his long hair and austere face engraved in fine detail. The coin gleams with a warm yellow luster, the sheen of pure gold carefully weighed and measured. In an age when much of Europe's coinage is debased copper mixed into silver, weights inconsistent, alloys shifting from mint to mint, the Florentine florin stands out for its reliability. Its weight is fixed at 3.53 grams of nearly pure gold, and its standard is enforced with a kind of civic pride that borders on obsession. The very name of Florence becomes intertwined with the coin's reputation. Merchants from Flanders to the Levant will accept a florin without weighing it, so certain are they of its purity. In a fragmented continent where every duchy, kingdom, and bishopric mints its own money, such uniformity is rare and valuable. But this reliability does not emerge by accident. Behind the coin lies an intricate web of political will, technical skill, and economic necessity. Florence in the mid-13th century is a rising power, its wealth built on the wool trade and on the banking houses that finance it. Wool from England and Flanders flows into the city, is dyed and finished by Florentine craftsmen, and then sold to markets across the Mediterranean. Such trade demands a currency that can move as freely as the goods themselves, without the constant haggling and recalculation that plague merchants forced to deal in shifting local coinage. The mint is the heart of this ambition. Located near the city's center, it is a place of noise and precision. Furnaces roaring, hammers striking, scales tipping. Gold arrives from multiple sources: African mines via Genoese and Venetian traders, coins melted down from other mints, sometimes even treasure brought home from the Crusades. Each batch is tested for purity, refined if necessary, and weighed with meticulous care. Any deviation from the standard is considered not merely a mistake, but an offense against the city's honor. Florence's decision to mint in gold is a statement of confidence. Most of Europe still relies on silver as the primary medium of exchange, partly because silver is more plentiful, partly because gold is seen as too precious for daily trade. But the Florentines understand something subtle. Gold's scarcity is an advantage for long-distance commerce. A smaller, lighter coin that carries greater value reduces the risk and cost of transport. A merchant traveling from Florence to Bruges can carry a month's profits in a pouch at his belt, instead of a chest in a wagon. Still, the Florin stability faces constant threats. Gold supply is never guaranteed. Wars, piracy, and political disputes can cut off trade routes overnight. The temptation to debase the coin to stretch the gold by adding cheaper metals is ever present, especially in years of civic debt. That Florence resists this temptation for so long is a testament to both its discipline and its self-interest. The city knows that the Florin's reputation is worth more than any short-term profit. Standardization, however, is not merely a matter of maintaining gold content. It is also about ensuring consistent weight. In the mint, scales are calibrated daily, their balance tested with precision weights carved from bronze or iron. The dies used to strike the coins are carved by skilled artisans, their designs checked for uniformity. Coins that fail the test too light, too heavy, poorly struck are melted down and recast. The mint's records note every ingot received, every coin struck, every batch approved or rejected. It is an early form of quality control, enforced not by modern industrial standards but by the watchful eyes of guild masters and civic officials. The Guild of Money Changers plays a crucial role in this system. Known as the Art del Cambio, its members are responsible for exchanging foreign coins into florins, verifying weights and purity, and ensuring that counterfeit or debased coins are detected before they can enter circulation. They maintain tables of exchange rates, updated regularly as foreign markets shift. In this way, the guild acts as a kind of financial filter, keeping the city's currency clean and its reputation intact. But Florence is not alone in recognizing the power of a trusted coin. Rival mints in Venice, Genoa, and beyond are also producing gold coinage, each with its own standard and design. The Venetian ducat, first minted in 1284, will become the florin's chief competitor, matching its weight and purity and eventually surpassing it in some markets. This rivalry forces both cities to maintain their standards. Neither can afford the loss of trust that would come from debasement. The florin's influence spreads quickly. By the late 13th century, it is being imitated in dozens of cities, from Hungary to the Low Countries. These imitations vary in quality. Some are honest copies, struck to the same weight and purity, while others are fraudulent, designed to deceive. The best counterfeiters are skilled enough that only a trained money changer can tell the difference. The worst are obvious, their gold pale from too much silver, their designs crude. In either case, the imitation is a backhanded compliment. The florin has become a standard worth copying. For the merchants who rely on it, the florin is more than a piece of metal. It is a tool of negotiation, a measure of trust, a silent witness to contracts and bargains. When a Florentine banker records a loan in his ledger, he specifies the amount in florins even if the actual payment will be made in another currency. When a wool dealer agrees to a shipment bound for Bruges, the price is set in florins, knowing that both parties can easily convert them upon arrival. The coin becomes a kind of shared language, bridging the gaps between markets, cultures, and laws. And yet, even the most stable coin is not immune to the currents of history. Gold flows toward war as easily as it flows toward trade. Kings borrow heavily to finance campaigns, and cities like Florence must decide whether to lend. If the loan is repaid, the florin's reach grows. If it is not, the loss can strain the very system that upholds the coin's value. Behind every bright, unblemished florin lies a chain of decisions to mine, to mint, to trust that must be renewed with each passing year. As you turn the coin over in your hand, you feel its weight in more than just grams. It carries the labor of miners and smiths, the judgment of merchants, the pride of a city determined to make its mark in gold. It is at once a tool of trade and a symbol of Florence's ambition. But in a continent of shifting alliances and uncertain borders, you cannot help but wonder, how long can any standard truly endure? In the counting houses of Florence, the florin was not merely a coin, it was an anchor in a sea of fluctuating values. Yet the moment it left the city walls, it entered a world of competing currencies, each with its own standard, alloy, and political backing. For the merchant traveling across Europe, the journey of a florin was not only physical but also mathematical. Every border crossing meant recalculating worth, negotiating rates, and guarding against the quiet erosion of value that could occur in a single exchange. The Guild of Money Changers in Florence, the Art del Cambio, maintained carefully written tables of equivalence, detailing how many florins were equal to a Venetian ducat, a French écu, an English noble, or a Hungarian forint. But these tables were never fixed. Exchange rates shifted with harvest yields, silver imports from Central Europe, or the outbreak of war in a distant duchy. A sack of florins might be worth more in Bruges this month than last, not because the florins had changed, but because the Flemish market had. And this was the paradox. The very stability of the florin in weight and purity made it a flexible instrument in trade. Merchants trusted that the coin itself would not betray them, which meant they were more willing to negotiate contracts, extend credit, and settle debts in florins. But this trust also meant the florin was a target. Counterfeiters sought to copy its exact weight, and rival cities minted near-identical coins to draw trade away from Florence. Crossing the Alps was one of the most treacherous stages of a merchant's journey, not only for the weather and the risk of banditry, but for the thicket of local tolls and currency traps along the way. Each territory might demand payment in its own coin, or impose a fee for exchanging florins into local tender. In some towns, foreign gold was officially unwelcome, but unofficially accepted if one knew the right person and was willing to accept a less favorable rate. In others, the florin commanded such respect that it could pass hand to hand without even being weighed. At the fairs of Champagne in northern France, which in the 13th and 14th centuries were among Europe's greatest trading hubs, the florin quickly became one of the preferred coins for large-scale deals. These fairs were not simply markets for goods, they were clearinghouses for debts and credits between merchants from across the continent. A merchant from Genoa could settle an obligation to a Flemish cloth dealer by transferring florins through a Florentine banker present at the fair, who would then adjust his own accounts with a partner in Florence. In such transactions, the coin might never physically change hands, it moved instead through the ledgers of trust. The florin's reputation, however, was constantly tested by the ebb and flow of gold itself. Sources of the precious metal were never constant. In some years, shipments from African mines via Saharan caravan routes and Mediterranean ports were plentiful. In others, storms, raids, or political instability cut off supply. A shortage of gold in Florence could drive the city to buy and melt foreign coins, restriking them as florins to maintain circulation. This practice, while effective, was also a delicate balancing act. Melt too many ducats, and Venice might take offense. Rely too heavily on imported gold, and Florence risked losing control over its own currency supply. Maintaining the florin standard required more than just minting discipline. It demanded a constant defense against debasement in the broader market. Unscrupulous money changers in foreign ports might clip coins, shaving tiny amounts of gold from the edges and reselling the shavings. Even a skilled merchant might not notice the difference until weighing the coin alongside an unaltered specimen. Florence countered this by producing florins with distinctive edges, and by training its money changers to detect even the slightest irregularity in weight or strike. The civic pride attached to the florin ran deep. In Florence, possession of the coin was more than a matter of wealth. It was a statement of belonging to a city whose fortunes were tied to its reliability. Public ceremonies occasionally displayed new minting dies or celebrated the striking of a particularly fine batch of coins. These events reinforced the idea that the florin was not just currency, but an emblem of Florence itself, as recognizable and as carefully guarded as the city's banners or guild seals. This pride also carried into diplomacy. When negotiating trade agreements with foreign cities, Florentine envoys often insisted on clauses guaranteeing the acceptance of the florin at specified rates. Such provisions effectively extended the city's economic territory, allowing the coin to operate as Florence's ambassador in markets far from Tuscany. Over time, entire regions became accustomed to using the florin as a standard of account, even when local coins remained in daily use. Yet the same stability that gave the florin its prestige could also become a vulnerability. In times of economic upheaval, when other states devalued their currencies to finance wars or pay debts, the florin remained firm. This could make it more expensive relative to other coins, discouraging its use in certain markets. For the merchant with a chest full of florins, such shifts could mean sudden losses if he was forced to exchange them in a region where their premium was too high for local buyers. Inside Florence, debates over the coin's management could be fierce. The mint was overseen by officials appointed by the Republic, but the great merchant banking families had influence as well. Proposals to adjust the weight or fineness of the florin were met with suspicion, for even a small change could undermine decades of trust. More often than not, these proposals were rejected, with the city choosing to endure short-term difficulties rather than risk its reputation. In the counting houses, clerks and bankers treated the florin as a constant in their calculations, a reliable measure against which all other values could be compared. Contracts might specify payment in florins, current in florins, meaning that only coins meeting the city's exact standard would be accepted. This phrase became a quiet but powerful assertion of control. Florence would not allow foreign imitations or clipped specimens to dilute the authority of its currency. By the early 14th century, the florin had become so widespread that even in regions where it was not the official coin, it served as a shadow currency. In some markets, large debts were recorded in florins even if settlement would ultimately be made in local silver coins, the amounts adjusted according to the current rate. In others, the florin circulated freely alongside local currency, preferred for its stability in larger transactions. Still, no coin is immortal. As you trace the path of the florin across mountains, rivers, and seas, you see how its journey depends on a fragile network of trust, politics, and trade. A war between distant kings can change its value overnight. A new gold discovery can flood the market and alter the balance of power between rival mints. The coin's reliability is a constant effort, not a fixed state A standard that must be defended at every scale, from the weighing tables of the mint to the negotiation tables of Europe's great fairs. And you cannot help but ask, in a world where every balance is temporary, how long can a city hold the scales steady? In the mid-14th century, the florin still glittered in the hands of merchants and princes alike. Its precise weight and high purity had made it the darling of long-distance commerce, a trusted medium of exchange in a continent fractured by competing coinages. Yet the very qualities that had propelled it to dominance would, over time, be tested by forces far beyond Florence's control. Gold is never simply a commodity. It is a reflection of human ambition, fear, and necessity. In the years following the Black Death, Europe's economy shifted in strange ways. Labor shortages drove up wages, trade routes changed as populations contracted, and cities, desperate to maintain revenues, began manipulating their currencies. Florence resisted the temptation for decades, clinging to the purity of the florin, but the pressures mounted. Part of the strain came from competition. Venice's ducat, introduced in 1284 with the same weight and fineness as the florin, had begun to outpace it in certain markets, particularly in the eastern Mediterranean. Venetian merchants dominated trade with the Levant, and the ducat's reliability, coupled with Venice's maritime supremacy, made it increasingly attractive to buyers and sellers in those ports. In Constantinople, Alexandria, and Damascus, the ducat often commanded the same trust the florin enjoyed in Bruges or London. Another source of pressure was war. The 14th and 15th centuries were not kind to the peace of Italy. The city-states fought among themselves, hired condottieri mercenary captains at great expense, and lent money to foreign kings in hopes of diplomatic advantage. Each campaign drained the treasury. For a city like Florence, whose wealth was so closely tied to its merchant bankers, the temptation to finance military needs through subtle adjustments to the coinage became harder to resist. Even without formal debasement, costs could creep into the system. The supply of gold from West Africa, funneled through North African ports and traded via Genoese and Venetian intermediaries, was subject to disruption. Political instability in the Mali Empire, piracy in the Mediterranean, and the capture of key trade routes by rivals could all reduce the flow of gold into Florence. When supply tightened, the mint faced difficult choices: raise the price of raw gold, mint fewer coins, or risk compromising the florin's standard. Inside the mint, the process remained as meticulous as ever, weighing, striking, inspecting, but the outside world began to see small shifts. Imitation florins, minted in cities from Hungary to the Low Countries, varied in quality. Some were honest copies, adhering to the Florentine weight and purity. Others were fraudulent, containing more silver than gold, their pale hue betraying the deception. These counterfeits could erode trust in the name florin if they circulated too widely without detection. The art del cambio fought back with vigilance. Money changers were trained to detect clipped edges, light weight, or suspicious color. Scales became more sensitive, testing methods improved. Public punishments for counterfeiters served as both justice and deterrence. But the sheer volume of trade meant that no system was perfect. Some bad coins inevitably slipped through, their flaws hidden in the rush of daily transactions. Florence's government also used the florin as a diplomatic tool. In treaties and trade agreements, clauses specifying florins of the current standard became a form of soft power, embedding the city's currency into the economic life of distant markets. This strategy worked best when Florence's political fortunes were strong, when its armies could defend its interests, and its merchants could flood foreign markets with goods. But when the city faltered, the reach of the florin contracted. By the early 15th century, the pressures of maintaining an unchanging standard in a changing world grew heavier. Wars in Lombardy, political turmoil within the Republic, and competition from both Venice and emerging powers like Milan strained Florence's resources. Bank failures such as the collapse of the Bardi and Peruzzi in the previous century lingered in memory, reminding citizens that financial stability was never guaranteed. The florin's gradual decline was not a sudden fall but a slow erosion. Other coins gained favor in certain markets. Local currencies, strengthened by their own reforms, began to challenge the florin's dominance. In some regions, the ducat became the preferred gold coin for large transactions, while the florin was reserved for dealings within Tuscany and its immediate neighbors. Yet even in its diminished role, the florin retained symbolic importance. It remained a mark of Florentine pride, a reminder of the city's golden age of trade and finance. The mint continued to produce it to the same weight and purity long after its heyday in international commerce had passed, if only to uphold tradition. In this sense, The florin became as much a cultural artifact as a tool of trade, a link between the present and a storied past. The story of the florin is, in many ways, a story about the limits of perfection. A coin can be struck to the highest standard, defended by the most diligent money changers, and honored in the ledgers of merchants across a continent, and still, the world will change around it. Wars will be fought, routes will shift, economies will grow and shrink. No standard, however perfect, can remain untouched forever. Yet perhaps that is not failure. For nearly 3 centuries, the florin held its weight and purity, surviving in a landscape where most coins were debased or replaced within decades. It facilitated trade from the Baltic to the Sahara, from London to Alexandria. It allowed contracts to be written with confidence, debts to be settled without dispute, and merchants to speak a common economic language across political and cultural divides. If you hold a surviving florin today, its gold still bright, its strike still sharp. You hold more than a piece of metal. You hold the residue of countless exchanges, the proof of trust given and honored, the ambition of a city that believed its name could be carried in gold across the known world. And as you turn it over, feeling its perfect weight, you might ask, what modern standard, so trusted today, will one day be just a relic in someone's hand, a fragment of a system long gone? Story 3. The paper that carried gold. You are seated at a long bench in a merchant's counting house in late 14th century Florence. The window is open just enough to let in the smell of wool dye from the street below, but your eyes are fixed on a narrow strip of parchment in front of you. It is not much to look at, a few lines of cramped handwriting, signed and sealed in wax. Yet this is no ordinary scrap of paper. It is a letter of exchange, a promise that gold will be paid in a distant city, without the need to carry a single coin across the treacherous roads between here and there. The idea is simple, almost deceptively so. One merchant owes another a sum of money, but instead of sending the payment in coin which could be stolen, lost, or taxed repeatedly along the way, he writes an instruction to a partner in another city to pay the sum on his behalf. The recipient of the letter presents it to the designated payer, who honors the debt in local currency. At its heart, the system is a web of mutual trust among merchant bankers who often never meet in person. Before such letters became common, moving money across Europe was an exhausting and risky affair. A merchant might pack a chest with florins, ducats, or silver marks and hire armed guards to escort it over the Alps. The journey could take weeks, with tolls to be paid at every border and the constant threat of robbery. Even if the money arrived safely, differences in coinage meant that the recipient might need to spend days negotiating exchanges, losing value at every step. The letter of exchange solved these problems by replacing the physical movement of gold with the movement of information. It transformed banking from the handling of coins to the handling of promises. This was not a new concept. Islamic merchants in the Middle East had been using similar instruments, called suftages, for centuries, but in Florence and other Italian city-states, the practice took on a particularly structured form, backed by the rigorous accounting methods of double-entry bookkeeping. In Florence, a letter of exchange was usually drafted in the vernacular Italian of the merchant class, though certain legal terms might be in Latin. The wording was deliberate and formulaic, leaving little room for ambiguity. It specified the amount, the currency in which it was to be paid, the location of payment, and the person to be paid. A typical example might read, in Venice, pay to the order of Marco di Giovanni the sum of 100 florins, value received here in Florence, and place it to my account with your branch there. The value received line was crucial. It meant that the issuer had already received something of value, cash, goods, or services in exchange for the promise to pay elsewhere. This kept the transaction grounded in an existing obligation, reducing the risk of fraud. The magic of the system was in the network that supported it. A banker in Florence might have partners in Genoa, Bruges, and London, all bound together by contracts and personal relationships. A letter issued in Florence could be redeemed in Bruges because the Florentine banker had a correspondent there who trusted his word, and more importantly, his ledger. At the end of a trading season, these correspondents would settle their accounts, often by offsetting debts rather than moving coins. In effect, the letters allowed merchants to trade across great distances without gold, ever leaving the vaults of the bankers who underpinned the system. But the letters of exchange were more than a convenience. They were also a way of sidestepping certain laws. The Catholic Church prohibited usury, the charging of interest on loans, but letters of exchange allowed merchants to earn a profit on currency differences instead. If a merchant in Florence wrote a letter promising payment in London, the sum could be converted into English pounds at a rate that subtly included an extra margin for the lender. This profit was not labeled as interest, but as an adjustment for exchange, thus avoiding direct violation of canon law. In reality, it was banking ingenuity wrapped in theological compliance. The Alps were the great barrier in this system, not just physically, but symbolically. To move coins across them was to invite danger. To move letters was to show mastery over space. Couriers, often young men employed by merchant houses, carried packets of correspondence through mountain passes, stopping at known inns where their employers had credit or friendly contacts. They traveled faster and lighter than any caravan of coin could, and their value lay not in what they carried physically, but in the promises those papers represented. The risk, however, did not disappear. Letters could be intercepted. A dishonest courier could sell the information to a rival. Cities at war could block the payment of foreign instruments. Even among trusted correspondents, disputes could arise if the letter's terms were vague or if exchange rates shifted dramatically before payment was due. For this reason, the back of many letters carried notes endorsements by successive holders if the letter was transferred to a third party. Each endorsement was both a guarantee and a liability. If the payer refused to honor the letter, the holder could pursue repayment from any prior endorser. In this way, a single piece of paper could pass through many hands, each leaving a trace of its journey. In the counting house, recording these letters was as important as drafting them. When a letter was issued, it appeared in the banker's books as both a debit and a credit, the debit representing the promise to pay in the future, the credit representing the value received today. This balance allowed the banker to track not just the amount owed, but also the chain of obligations connected to it. For large firms, these entries could number in the hundreds over the course of a trading season, weaving a web of credit and debt that spanned the continent. The social dimension of letters of exchange cannot be overlooked. To issue or redeem one successfully was a statement of reliability. A banker who defaulted on a letter could see his reputation ruined across Europe in a matter of weeks, as word spread among the merchant networks. Conversely, a house that honored its obligations promptly and without dispute could attract more business than it could handle. In a time when legal enforcement across borders was limited, reputation was the true currency, and the letter of exchange was its proof. In the quiet of the counting house, the letter on your desk is ready to be sealed. It will travel north with a courier leaving at dawn, bound for a partner's bench in Venice. There, it will be presented, recorded, and paid perhaps in gold ducats instead of florins, the currency adjusted according to the day's rates. The parchment will be kept on file for years in case disputes arise, and then, when its usefulness has ended, it may be burned or discarded. Yet for the weeks it travels, this unassuming slip of paper will be worth more than its weight in gold, because it will carry gold, invisibly, across mountains and borders. And you can't help but wonder, if a promise can travel so far without changing hands, is it the gold that moves the world or the trust behind it? In the gray morning light, the courier carrying your sealed letter of exchange departs Florence. His satchel is light, containing little more than a bundle of folded parchments and a small dagger for the road. The weight he carries is not in metal, but in obligation, the invisible load of debts and promises that stretches from Tuscany to the far side of the Alps. It will take him several days to reach the first major stop on his journey, perhaps Bologna or Milan, where he will hand off lesser letters or collect replies for merchants awaiting news from Florence. The great letter for Venice will remain sealed until it reaches its destination. Along the way, he will avoid certain routes known for bandits, stick to recognized inns where his employer has credit, and sometimes join a caravan for added safety. His life is measured in miles and signatures. The letters of exchange that he carries are more than tools of commerce, they are also instruments of timing. Payment is not always due upon presentation. Many letters specify a term, 30, 60, even 90 days after sight. This delay allows merchants to arrange for funds, sell goods, or complete other transactions before settling the debt. It also provides an opportunity for the issuer to profit from fluctuations in exchange rates, a subtle art known to the more ambitious banking houses. Timing could be everything. Imagine a Florentine banker who owes payment in London in 60 days. If he anticipates that the pound will weaken against the florin during that time, he can write the letter now, but settle later at a more favorable rate, pocketing the difference. Such speculation was risky. A sudden political event or change in the bullion supply could reverse the market, but when done skillfully, it added quiet profit to the banker's books. This practice was one of the ways Italian merchants skirted the church's ban on usury. Technically, they were not charging interest, they were adjusting for exchange, which was perfectly acceptable under canon law. In reality, the timing of payments and the manipulation of rates could function very much like interest, rewarding the lender for the use of his money over time. The trust required for such arrangements was immense. A merchant in Florence might write a letter instructing payment in Bruges, knowing that his correspondent there would honor it without hesitation. This trust was not given lightly. It was built over years, often across generations, reinforced by family alliances, guild membership, and the quiet record of fulfilled obligations in the ledgers. One failure, one unpaid letter could ripple outward, damaging not just the banker's business, but the reputation of his city. That reputation was, in itself, a form of currency. The great Florentine banking houses, the Bardi, the Peruzzi, later the Medici, understood this well. Their letters of exchange circulated as widely as their coins, and in some markets the paper was considered as good as gold. For a merchant in London or Barcelona, receiving a letter from a reputable Florentine house meant the transaction was backed by a network of wealth and influence stretching across Europe. The letters also encouraged the growth of what we might call today a clearing system. Instead of shipping gold back and forth to settle every debt, merchants would net out what was owed. A banker in Bruges might receive 3 letters instructing him to pay out gold, and 5 letters entitling him to receive gold. Rather than moving metal for each transaction, he would balance the accounts, settling only the difference. This greatly reduced the cost and risk of moving bullion, and it made the system more efficient for all participants. Such efficiency, however, depended on meticulous bookkeeping. Every letter had to be recorded the moment it was written, noting the date, amount, currency, payer, and payee. When a letter was redeemed, the payment had to be entered in the ledger, along with any fees or rate adjustments. Mistakes could be catastrophic. An unrecorded letter might result in an unexpected claim months later. An error in exchange rates could turn a profitable deal into a loss. The clerks who managed these books were trained to think in terms of both place and time. Each entry was a point in a web, connected to other entries by obligation and sequence. They learned to see patterns. A sudden increase in letters payable in a particular city might signal an opportunity or a looming shortage of coin there. A gap in payments might hint at trouble, such as a debtor delaying for lack of funds or a market experiencing disruption. The physical letters themselves were often beautiful in their simplicity, narrow slips of parchment with type, even script, folded and sealed with wax. Some bore watermarks from the paper mills of Fabriano, a sign of quality in the materials themselves. The seal was both a mark of authenticity and a practical safeguard. Breaking it without authorization was a serious offense, punishable by both law and guild discipline. But even seals and signatures could be forged. For this reason, many merchant houses developed private marks, small flourishes in the handwriting, or tiny cuts in the edge of the parchment that could help identify genuine documents. Trusted couriers might carry verbal passwords or phrases to confirm authenticity upon delivery. The web of trust was always under quiet attack, and the defenses were as much social as they were physical. One of the more subtle risks in the letter of exchange system was political interference. A city at war might order its merchants not to honor letters from an enemy state, or it might seize payments due to foreign creditors as a form of economic pressure. In such cases, the value of the letter evaporated instantly, replaced by the uncertain hope that the debt might be repaid when peace returned. Merchants learned to spread their risk, diversifying both their routes and their correspondence so that a single political crisis could not ruin them. For the recipient of a letter, presentation was a formal act. In Venice, for example, the holder might enter the counting house of the paying banker, present the sealed document, and wait as the clerk examined it. The clerk would compare it to his own records, check the signatures, and calculate the exact amount due in local currency. If all was in order, payment would be made perhaps in coin, perhaps in another letter for use elsewhere. The original letter would then be marked as paid and filed away. The life of a letter of exchange was rarely glamorous, but it was transformative. It turned credit into something portable, negotiable, and most importantly transferable across borders. It made it possible for goods to move ahead of payment, for merchants to take risks they might otherwise avoid, and for distant markets to be linked in ways that coin alone could not achieve. And yet, as the courier approaches the Venetian lagoon, the weight of its fragility becomes clear. One dishonest partner, one intercepted courier, one war, and the paper could become nothing more than a meaningless scrap. The entire system depends on a shared belief that words written in ink can compel the movement of gold weeks later, hundreds of miles away. It is this paradox that lingers in your mind. The letter of exchange is both stronger and more fragile than the coins it replaces. Stronger, because it can cross borders without fear of theft. More fragile, because it relies entirely on the invisible chain of human trust. And you begin to wonder, is the real currency of medieval Europe gold, or the promise that gold will be there when you arrive? The counting house in Venice is quiet except for the faint scratching of a clerk's quill. It is late in the afternoon, and the room smells faintly of salt air drifting in from the lagoon. The courier from Florence arrives, dust on his boots, and produces from his satchel the sealed letter of exchange. The clerk examines the seal, notes the watermark on the paper, and turns it over in his hands before carefully breaking it open. Inside, the letter's instructions are clear. Payment of 100 florins, current in Florence, to be made to Marco di Giovanni or his order. The clerk opens a large, leather-bound ledger and finds the matching entry, written in neat, slanted script. The transaction is recorded as part of a larger web of accounts linking the Venetian branch of this merchant banking network to its partners in Florence, Bruges, and London. In this web, gold itself rarely moves, only the rights to gold. The payment is made not in florins, but in gold ducats, Venice's own currency, calculated at the day's agreed exchange rate. The coins are counted out carefully on the table, their bright yellow edges clinking softly. Marco signs a receipt, and the clerk makes a note in the ledger that the obligation has been fulfilled. The letter itself is marked paid and filed with dozens of others in a wooden chest, where it will rest until the year's accounts are closed. What has just happened is deceptively simple. A payment has been made without a single coin crossing the Alps. But beneath that simplicity lies an entire architecture of agreements, relationships, and record-keeping. The Florence branch now owes less to its Venetian correspondent, and this change will ripple through the system when the two settle their balances perhaps months from now, perhaps at the great fairs of Champagne or in a quiet meeting room in Genoa. This invisible network is the true innovation of the letter of exchange system. The physical paper is only the outward sign of a deeper reality, a web of credits and debits, constantly shifting, constantly balanced, that connects cities hundreds of miles apart. Each banker's ledger is like a mirror of this network, showing from one perspective the debts owed, the credits held, and the names of those who can be trusted to honor them. The system thrives because it solves multiple problems at once. It eliminates the physical risk of transporting coins, reduces the transaction costs of repeated currency exchanges, and allows capital to flow faster than goods. It also creates a layer of abstraction that is politically useful. If a merchant in Florence owes money to one in London, the debt can be settled without either city's gold reserves being directly involved, useful in times of political tension or fluctuating alliances. Still, the network's strength is also its vulnerability. Because it rests entirely on trust, a single default can send shockwaves through the system. When a major Florentine bank failed, as the Bardi and Peruzzi did in the mid-14th century, after Edward III of England defaulted on enormous loans, the collapse was felt far beyond Tuscany. Letters of exchange drawn on those houses suddenly became worthless, and merchants across Europe were left scrambling to fill the gaps. The default of a prominent house could even change political relationships. Cities might hesitate to do business with merchants from a place whose bankers had recently failed. Rival merchant communities, the Genoese, the Venetians, might seize the opportunity to expand their influence, offering their own letters of exchange as a safer alternative. In this way, financial trust and political power were intertwined. To manage risk, many merchant bankers diversified their networks. A single transaction might involve correspondence in 3 or 4 cities, each connected by separate letters. If one link in the chain failed, others might still hold. Some houses even maintained redundant routes for couriers, sending duplicate letters by different roads to reduce the risk of loss or interception. The maturity of the letter of exchange system also gave rise to secondary markets. In certain cases, a merchant who held a letter payable in another city might sell it at a discount to someone who could use it there. This turned letters into a kind of negotiable instrument, a commodity in their own right. A skilled merchant could profit by buying letters cheaply in one place and redeeming them for full value elsewhere, exploiting differences in local demand for payment instruments. The legal framework for these transactions was a patchwork of local laws, guild regulations, and long-standing custom. While no single authority oversaw the entire system, the shared interest of merchants in keeping it functional led to a remarkable degree of self-enforcement. Disputes were often resolved privately, through negotiation or arbitration by respected figures in the merchant community. A banker who refused to honor a legitimate letter could find himself effectively blacklisted, unable to participate in the network that sustained his livelihood. This culture of self-regulation was one of the system's quiet strengths. It allowed it to operate across political and linguistic boundaries in a way that formal state institutions of the time could not. A Florentine merchant could deal with a Catalan or a Hanseatic trader through the shared language of exchange, the mutual understanding of how a letter should be written, endorsed, and redeemed. Even as the physical act of redeeming a letter was routine, its consequences could be far-reaching. The payment made in Venice today might settle a debt in Florence, fund a shipment to Alexandria, or provide capital for a new venture in Bruges. Money, once freed from the weight of metal, could move in more fluid and creative ways, shaping the flow of goods and the fortunes of cities. By the late medieval period, the letter of exchange had become so common that it was hard to imagine long-distance trade without it. It was the nervous system of Europe's commercial body, transmitting signals and obligations across great distances with remarkable speed and reliability. And like a nervous system, it was largely invisible, felt in its effects rather than seen in its workings. As you leave the counting house, the thought lingers. The gold itself matters less than the agreement about where and when it will appear. The real power lies not in the coins locked in a strong box, but in the lines of ink that direct their movement. The letter of exchange is a reminder that wealth is not just what you hold in your hand, but what others are willing to deliver when you ask. And you might ask yourself, in a world that runs on promises, how much of our wealth is truly tangible and how much is simply trust, written down? Story 4. Morning Ledgers and Dusty Light. The day begins before sunrise. The city of Florence is still half asleep, its narrow streets echoing only with the slow footsteps of bakers and the occasional clang of a watchman's halberd against the stones. In the counting house of a mid-sized merchant banking firm, the lamps have already been lit. Their light falls in warm circles on the long wooden benches, illuminating stacks of parchment, wax tablets, and the neat rows of sand-filled inkwells. You are a clerk, not a partner, not yet, and your place is at the far table, near the wall where the morning sun will eventually find its way through the shutters. The first order of business is to open the memorial, the rough daybook where yesterday's transactions were hastily recorded. The ink is smudged in places. Some notes are in shorthand, others half-finished, waiting for clarification. You sharpen your quill with a small knife, dip it into the ink, and begin transferring the entries into the giornal, the more formal daybook, where the handwriting must be clear and the columns exact. The work is repetitive but not mindless. As you rewrite each entry, you check the numbers, note any inconsistencies, and occasionally add details left out in the rush of the previous day. An entry might read, "Paid to the wool dyers of the Art della Lana for 6 bolts, to be delivered to the Fondaco dei Tedeschi in Venice, 48 florins, drawn from the account of Messer Piero di Bartolo." You must be sure the amount is correct, that the currency is specified, and that both debit and credit are recorded. If anything is unclear, you make a small mark in the margin to discuss with the senior clerk later. The counting house begins to stir as the partners arrive. They greet each other with brief nods, their minds already on the business of the day. One goes to his desk to review correspondence from Bruges. Another begins dictating a letter to a client in Pisa. The apprentice, barely 12 years old, is sent out to deliver a note to the goldsmiths' guild. Meanwhile, you and the other clerks keep working through the memorial, your ears attuned to the hum of activity around you. The counting house is not large, but it is dense with the tools of trade. Along one wall, shelves hold rows of ledgers bound in dark leather, each labeled with the year and the type of account: Libro Mastro for 1384, Libro dei Debitori for 1385, and so on. Next to them are small locked chests containing coins, seals, and important contracts. A large table near the front is reserved for weighing and counting money. The scales are precise, their pans polished from daily use. A set of standard weights lies in a small wooden box, guarded like treasure. By mid-morning, the first clients arrive. A wool merchant comes to deposit earnings from a recent sale, paid in a mix of florins and Venetian ducats. You help weigh the coins, noting their weight and purity. The ducats will be recorded at the current exchange rate, agreed upon by both parties. The merchant signs a receipt, and the coins are carried to the strongbox, where they will remain until needed for other payments. The transaction is entered into the giornal. At once delay invites error. Then comes a messenger from Pisa, bringing a letter of exchange payable in Florence. The senior clerk examines it, comparing the handwriting and seal to the firm's records. Once verified, the amount is entered into the ledger and payment made. As you watch, you realize how much of this business rests on personal recognition: the way a seal is impressed, the style of a signature, the choice of paper. To a stranger, these might seem trivial. To a banker, they are as telling as a man's face. Not all work involves receiving money. Much of the morning is spent drafting letters, instructions to correspondents in Bruges about a shipment of English wool, inquiries to a partner in Barcelona about the state of the silver market, reminders to clients about upcoming payments. Each letter must be clear, respectful, and precise. Ambiguity is dangerous in trade. Once written, The letters are sealed with wax and set aside for the afternoon courier. As noon approaches, the counting house grows warmer. Sunlight filters through the shutters, lighting the dust motes drifting in the air. The partners take a brief meal in the back room, bread, cheese, and watered wine, while the clerks remain at their benches, using the quiet to finish their transfers from the memorial. You pause for a moment to stretch your cramped fingers, noticing how the faint smell of ink has already settled into your clothes. There is little glamour in this work, yet there is a certain dignity in its precision. Each line you write is a thread in a vast fabric of trust that stretches across cities and kingdoms. A single error could weaken the whole. You know that every coin counted, every rate calculated, every name entered into the ledger has its place in this delicate balance. By the time the church bells toll for the afternoon, the journal is nearly up to date, the morning's deposits and payments recorded, and the partners are preparing for the next round of business, negotiating loans, exchanging currencies, and sending instructions to their agents abroad. And as you sit there, quill in hand, you realize the counting house is not simply a room where money is moved and recorded. It is a machine for manufacturing trust, one careful entry at a time. But you can't help wondering what happens to that machine when the day ends and the bustle fades into quiet. When the bells of Santa Maria del Fiore toll for the early afternoon, the counting house changes its rhythm. The frantic stream of morning deposits and coin weighing slows, replaced by the quieter but more intricate work of reconciling accounts and arranging the movement of money across the merchant network. The shutters are opened a little wider to let in the cooler air, and the light now falls across the main table, where the partners gather for their daily review. You are summoned from your bench to assist with the libro mastro, the master ledger. It is the beating heart of the firm's records, and the partners trust only their most careful clerks to handle it. The book is heavy, bound in dark leather with brass corners, its pages thick with the faint texture of scraped parchment. Opening it is like lifting the lid on a city's memory. Here, in tidy columns, are the debts and credits of merchants, nobles, and even foreign rulers. The task is straightforward in theory. Ensure that each client's account is current, that the debits match the credits, and that any overdue obligations are flagged for attention. In practice, it requires an unerring eye and a mind trained to spot patterns. A missing endorsement on a letter of exchange, a gap in the repayment schedule, a number that doesn't align with the journal, all are cause for concern. Some can be resolved with a quick consultation, others may hint at deeper trouble. Today, one such anomaly emerges. A payment from Bruges recorded in the journal has not yet appeared in the libro mastro. The amount is small, 25 florins, but the omission must be explained. You trace it back through the memorial and find a note in the margin, awaiting confirmation from correspondent. It is a reminder that not all transactions are final the moment they are written. In the world of long-distance trade, money can exist in a kind of limbo for weeks, even months, until all parties have signed off. The partners discuss the matter in low tones, deciding to send a letter north with the next courier. Such correspondence is often as much about tone as about content. The phrasing must be firm enough to prompt action, but not so sharp as to damage the relationship. In the merchant world, the preservation of goodwill is often worth more than the swift collection of a small debt. Once the ledgers have been reviewed for the day, attention turns to negotiations. A representative from a local wool guild arrives to discuss financing for a large shipment to Pisa. The arrangement is typical. The guild needs capital to pay for dyes and transport. The counting house will advance the money in exchange for repayment, plus a fee disguised as an exchange rate adjustment. As the discussion unfolds, you note the details in a small draft ledger, not yet official, but ready to be entered once the terms are finalized. Such meetings are an education in the subtle art of merchant diplomacy. The guild representative speaks of opportunity and mutual benefit. The senior partner speaks of risk and the need for guarantees. Each uses the language of cooperation, but both are weighing the other's strength and reliability. You realize that this is another form of balancing, not of numbers on a page, but of human intentions. While the negotiations proceed, you return to your bench to handle the afternoon correspondence. Incoming letters arrive from Pisa, Genoa, and Barcelona, carried by the midday courier. Some bring simple updates: a shipment of alum unloaded safely in Genoa, a minor delay in wool processing in Pisa. Others carry more complex news, such as fluctuations in the silver market in Spain or rumors of unrest along a key trade route. These must be read, summarized, and passed to the appropriate partner for consideration. The outgoing letters are prepared with equal care. A payment instruction to a correspondent in Barcelona is written in the familiar formula, with every detail checked twice: the amount, the currency, the payee's name, the due date. Once approved, it is folded, sealed with the firm's emblem, and set aside for the evening dispatch. These letters are the lifelines of the firm, carrying its influence and obligations far beyond Florence's walls. In the quieter hours of mid-afternoon, you also tend to the petty accounts, the small but steady flow of payments for office expenses, messenger fees, and supplies. The purchase of fresh ink, the repair of a strongbox lock, the fee for weighing a shipment of coin, all must be recorded. The discipline is the same, whether the amount is a single florin or 100. Over time, you have learned that neglecting small sums invites disorder into the larger ones. Every so often, a messenger arrives with a pouch of coins from a local merchant to be deposited into his account. The process is methodical: weigh each coin, confirm its purity, record its value, and issue a receipt. In one such deposit today, a Venetian ducat weighs slightly less than it should. You bring it to the senior clerk, who examines it closely before setting it aside for melting and reminting. Even in a city proud of its monetary standards, clipped or worn coins still find their way into circulation. By late afternoon, the counting house begins to prepare for the daily balance. This is the moment when the day's receipts and payments are tallied to ensure that the physical coins in the strongbox match the recorded amounts in the ledgers. It is a ritual of precision. The coins are brought to the main table, weighed in batches, and compared to the totals written in ink. Any discrepancy, no matter how small, is cause for immediate investigation. Today, the balance is exact, a quiet satisfaction for everyone involved. The partners exchange brief nods, the clerks close the ledgers, and the strongbox is locked. But the work is not truly finished. Tomorrow will bring new entries, new letters, and new negotiations, each adding to the intricate weave of obligations that keeps the counting house alive. As the shadows lengthen and the last client departs, you glance at the shelves of ledgers, each one a year's worth of transactions. They are more than records, they are the memory of a city's commerce, written in numbers and names, preserved in leather and ink. And you begin to wonder, when the sun sets and the counting house empties, does the trust it has built during the day linger in the silence, or must it be rebuilt, entry by entry, each morning? By the time the bells mark the evening hour, the counting house has taken on a different character. The morning's bustle of clients, messengers, and negotiations has faded. Now, the room hums with a slower, more deliberate energy. The lamps are lit again, their soft glow warming the worn wood of the benches and catching in the polished brass weights on the money table. The air smells faintly of tallow from the candles and the metallic tang of recently handled coins. The partners retreat to the back of the room for their final discussion of the day, leaving the clerks to their closing duties. The journal is laid open, and each transaction from the afternoon is reviewed once more. This is not busywork. The final check before locking up ensures that tomorrow will begin with order, not confusion. Any entry found lacking a date, signature, or complete description must be corrected now. Errors left overnight have a way of multiplying in the days that follow. The libro mastro, the master ledger, is brought out for the last time today. Its heavy covers make a muted thump as it lands on the table. You turn the pages carefully, noting the smoothness that comes from years of handling. The accounts updated in the afternoon are checked against the original entries, ensuring that the balances match. In one, a small adjustment is needed. A shipment payment from Genoa has been partially offset by the sale of alum in Florence, requiring a recalculation of the outstanding debt. The figures are amended, the change initialed in the margin, and the page is closed with a sense of finality. The strongbox is open for the coin audit the last of the day. The day's receipts and disbursements are counted one more time, this time with both a clerk and a partner present, each watching the other's hands. The sound of coins on the scale is steady and rhythmic, almost meditative. The tallies match exactly a quiet triumph. The coins are then sorted by type: florins in one compartment, ducats in another, silver pieces in a third. Worn or clipped coins are placed in a small cloth bag to be taken to the goldsmith for assaying. When the strongbox is closed and the heavy iron lock turned, a faint feeling of relief passes through the room. The day's tangible wealth is now sealed away, safe from the uncertainties of the night. But the real wealth, the obligations recorded in the ledgers, remains in the open, spread across the benches in ink and parchment. Now comes a part of the day that feels more private: the internal correspondence. Notes are drafted for the firm's own records, summarizing the day's key events, contracts agreed upon, letters sent, anomalies discovered. These summaries will be bound together at the end of the year, forming a kind of diary of the business. They are not meant for clients or outsiders. They are a memory kept for the house alone. Reading through the volumes from earlier years is like walking through the city's commercial past, page by page. Occasionally, a partner will dictate a more personal letter, one to a family member managing a distant branch, or to a trusted correspondent in another city. These letters blend business with friendship, reporting on the health of mutual acquaintances, the state of the markets, and the latest political rumors. The tone is warmer than in the formal contracts, yet no less precise when it comes to matters of money. Friendship and commerce often share the same ink. The apprentice is given the task of sweeping the floor and refilling the inkwells for the morning. The smell of fresh ink mingles with the faint dust stirred from the wooden boards. You put away your tools: the quill, the small knife for sharpening it, the ruler for drawing clean ledger lines. These are humble objects, but in the hands of a careful clerk they are the instruments of the counting house's true work, the maintenance of trust through order. Outside, the street grows darker, the shouts of merchants replaced by the distant sound of evening prayers. The counting house shutters are closed, and the heavy wooden door is barred. The partners gather their cloaks and hats, pausing to exchange a few last words about tomorrow's meetings. The clerks follow, stepping out into the cooling air, their minds still half on the numbers they've spent the day shaping. Walking home through the narrow streets, you pass other counting houses doing the same. Doors closing, lamps being extinguished, apprentices hurrying away with errands to finish before nightfall. You realize that the entire city breathes with this rhythm: an inhalation of trade in the morning, an exhalation of accounts at dusk. Tomorrow the cycle will begin again. New coins weighed, new letters written, new negotiations carried out. And with each day the ledgers will grow, line by line, into a record that is both fragile and enduring. But as you look back at the shuttered windows of your counting house, you can't help but think: when the ink dries and the coins lie locked away, is the day's trust truly secure, or is it always waiting to be tested when the sun rises again? Story 5. Under the Eye of the Art del Cambio. The Piazza del Campo in Siena is wide and sunlit, its distinctive shell shape drawing the eye toward the Palazzo Pubblico at its base. On market days, the square fills with stalls and chatter: wool merchants from Florence, grain dealers from the surrounding countryside, and travelers carrying goods from as far as Marseille and Constantinople. But near the center, away from the chaos of produce baskets and wool bales, the money changers have set up their benches. Here, beneath the public eye, the Art del Cambio, the Guild of Money Changers, keeps a silent but firm watch. Siena's money changers are not mere coin exchangers. They are the city's financial middlemen, its guarantors of currency purity, and, increasingly, its bankers. Their benches are not just places to swap foreign coins for local lire or florins, they are also where merchants can deposit funds, arrange loans, and settle debts with letters of exchange. In a time when Siena's trade rivals that of Florence, these benches are the nervous system of the city's economy. Membership in the Art del Cambio is both privilege and burden. Only those admitted to the guild can legally operate as money changers in Siena, and entry requires both sponsorship by existing members and the approval of the city's governing council. The process is designed to keep standards high and protect the city's financial reputation. Applicants must demonstrate not only skill in weighing and valuing coins, but also a clean record of conduct, a history of keeping agreements, paying debts, and dealing honestly. Once admitted, members are bound by the Capitali dell'Arte, the Guild's rulebook. These regulations are exhaustive. They specify the hours during which benches may operate, the exact weight and fineness standards for coins in circulation, the fees allowed for exchanges, and the penalties for infractions. A money changer who is caught clipping coins, passing counterfeits, or charging excessive fees can be fined, suspended, or even expelled from the Guild, a professional death sentence. The Guild's oversight extends to the tools of the trade. Scales must be inspected regularly, and standard weights, usually small discs of bronze or iron, are provided by the city. Each money changer's bench has a small locked compartment for these weights, and tampering with them is a criminal offense. The Guild also mandates the keeping of ledgers, in which every transaction must be recorded in a clear hand, available for inspection upon request. These rules are meant to foster trust, but they also serve another purpose: to maintain the Guild's monopoly. No one outside the Art del Cambio may legally operate as a money changer within Siena's jurisdiction. Traveling merchants who wish to exchange currency must go through a Guild member, paying the prescribed fee. In theory, this prevents fraud. In practice, it also channels a steady flow of business and profit into the hands of a select few. The Guild Hall itself stands just off the Piazza del Campo, a sturdy building of brick and stone with a small chapel inside. Here, members meet to discuss business, settle disputes, and vote on matters affecting their trade. The atmosphere at these gatherings is formal but not unfriendly. Rivalries exist, of course, in a profession where fortunes rise and fall with the value of gold and silver. Competition is inevitable, but the Guild's rules keep those rivalries from boiling over into open conflict. Or at least they are meant to. Because beneath the surface of the Art del Cambio's orderly regulations, there are quiet rebellions. Some members, particularly the more ambitious ones, find ways to bend the rules without breaking them outright. A money changer might, for example, offer a slightly better rate to a trusted merchant friend, or discreetly accept a foreign coin the Guild has deemed unsuitable, knowing he can pass it on elsewhere for a profit. Others might arrange to settle large debts through letters of exchange that avoid the Guild's official fees, keeping the transactions off the books entirely. Such practices are risky. If discovered, they can lead to censure or worse. But in a competitive environment, the temptation is strong, especially when rival cities like Florence or Pisa offer more flexible terms to merchants. Siena's economy is tied not only to its local market, but also to the great trading networks that span Europe and the Mediterranean, and the money changers must compete for a place within them. The Guild's inspectors, men chosen from among the more senior members, conduct regular checks of benches and ledgers. They arrive without warning, weighing coins, examining records, and sometimes even questioning clients. Most money changers submit to these inspections with polite patience, but some bristle under the scrutiny, seeing it as an intrusion into their affairs. The tension between oversight and autonomy is a constant undercurrent in the Guild's life. For the average money changer in Siena, the day is long and meticulous. He must know the current exchange rates for dozens of coins, from the Venetian ducat to the French écu to the gold florin of Florence. Rates shift constantly, influenced by political events, trade flows, and even the success or failure of distant harvests. A skilled money changer can read these shifts almost instinctively, adjusting his offers to protect his profit while keeping clients satisfied. By late afternoon, as the shadows lengthen in the Piazza del Campo, the benches are packed away. The day's coins are carried home or to a secure strong room, and the ledgers are closed until morning. But even as the city settles into evening, the work of the money changers continues in private meetings, in whispered arrangements over wine, in letters sent to partners in other cities. And in those private spaces, the guild's official rules sometimes give way to more personal codes, loyalties, and calculations that exist beyond the reach of the Capitale dell'Arte. Which raises the question, in Siena's world of regulated benches and guarded scales, where does true power lie, in the rules that govern the trade, or in the quiet deals that happen just beyond them? Morning in Siena's Piazza del Campo begins with the scrape of wooden benches being dragged into place. The money changers' benches are simple structures broad enough to spread out coins for weighing and examination, sturdy enough to bear the small but dense iron-bound chests in which the day's reserves are kept. Each bench is a personal stage, its edge worn smooth by years of elbows leaning over deals, its surface stained by ink and the faint tarnish of silver dust. The Art del Cambio's official presence is visible even at this early hour. An inspector, wearing the small badge of the guild, walks between the benches, exchanging brief greetings with the members already at work. His eyes scan for obvious irregularities, scales improperly set, weights missing from their compartments, coins laid out without covers against the dust. Most mornings, nothing is amiss. The inspectors know that true infractions rarely happen in plain sight. By mid-morning, the square fills with life. Farmers arrive from the countryside, carrying sacks of grain to sell. Cloth merchants unfurl bolts of dyed wool. Fishmongers call out their wares. And threading through it all, merchants from other cities seek out the money changers. The sound of coins hitting scales is steady, almost rhythmic. Each clink marks a transaction, perhaps a Venetian ducat being converted to Sienese lire, or a French écu weighed to confirm its gold content before being accepted at a discount for its wear. The rates posted at each bench are the official ones, agreed upon at the last guild meeting and adjusted for the day's known conditions. But these posted rates are not the whole story. The more experienced money changers know their clients well, and relationships often matter more than numbers written on a board. A trusted merchant, one who has proven himself reliable over years of dealings, might be given a slightly better rate than a stranger. A rival's loyal customer might find his offer just a touch less favorable, a quiet nudge toward shifting his business. Such preferential treatment is technically discouraged by the guild, which insists on fairness and uniformity to maintain Siena's reputation. But the guild also understands that relationships are the lifeblood of trade, and enforcing absolute equality is neither practical nor desirable. As long as the deviations are small and subtle, they tend to pass unnoticed or at least unpunished. Beyond the posted exchanges, there are transactions the guild would prefer to ignore. A merchant might bring coins that the Capitale dell'Arte have deemed unfit for circulation, clipped, debased, or from a mint of ill repute. Officially, these should be refused. Unofficially, a money changer might accept them quietly, planning to pass them along in a distant city where the scrutiny is less strict. Such deals are made with discretion, often in the back room of a nearby tavern, with only trusted associates present. There is also the matter of letters of exchange. While Siena's guild regulates coin transactions closely, the paper side of banking is harder to police. Two members might agree to settle a debt via a letter payable in Florence or Pisa, bypassing the guild's prescribed fees for handling large payments in coin. To an outsider, such arrangements look like mere favors between colleagues. To the guild's more observant members, they are a quiet erosion of the official monopoly. Afternoons bring a different kind of business. Once the morning's bustle subsides, money changers often turn to longer-term arrangements, financing shipments, lending to merchants awaiting payment for goods, or investing in ventures abroad. These deals are rarely struck in the open. They are discussed in shaded arcades, over cups of wine in private rooms, or in the cool quiet of the guild hall. Here, the talk is slower, the calculations more complex. The sums involved might be 10 times those exchanged at the bench in a morning's work. This blending of official and unofficial activity is a delicate dance. The guild's rules are strict, but its members are practical. They know that too much rigidity can drive business to rival cities, while too much leniency can invite fraud and disorder. The challenge is to keep the balance to enforce enough oversight to preserve trust, without smothering the trade that gives the art del cambio its power. Occasionally, that balance tips. A few years ago, one of Siena's more prominent money changers was caught passing debased silver from a North African mint, coins that had been quietly refused in Florence. The guild fined him heavily and suspended his bench for 6 months. Yet when he returned, most of his clients came back as well. In trade, memory is short when profit is good and trust is personal. For you, a younger clerk apprenticed to a seasoned money changer, the lesson is clear. The guild's rules are important, but so is understanding when they bend. Your master teaches you to weigh coins with a practiced flick of the wrist, to recognize the faint dullness that betrays low silver content, to speak warmly to regular clients while keeping a cautious reserve with strangers. He also teaches you, with more care, how to judge when a quiet exception might strengthen a relationship rather than weaken it. As the afternoon shadows lengthen in the Piazza del Campo, the benches are packed away once again. The coins are taken to secure storerooms, the scales locked in their cases, the ledgers closed. The inspector makes one last pass through the square, exchanging polite farewells. Tomorrow, the benches will return to their places, and the cycle will begin again. And you find yourself wondering, in a city where the guild's rules shape every public act, is the real power in the hands of those who write the rules or those who know how to work at their edges? Evening falls quickly in Siena. The golden light that bathes the Piazza del Campo in late afternoon gives way to shadow, and the sounds of trade are replaced by the softer murmur of conversation drifting from tavern doors. The money changers have closed their benches, but their work is far from finished. Behind shuttered windows, accounts are tallied, letters are written, and strategies are quietly adjusted for the day to come. In one such room, lit by the steady glow of an oil lamp, a senior member of the Art del Cambio sits at a long table. His ledger is open before him, but his eyes are on a folded letter lying just beside it. It arrived that afternoon, carried by a merchant fresh from Florence. The letter is from a trusted associate in Genoa, and it contains news. The price of silver in the Levant has shifted sharply, owing to unrest in one of the ports. For a money changer with the right connections, such news is not just interesting, it is opportunity. Officially, the guild discourages rapid speculation. Rates are set by consensus, and while they are adjusted regularly, the goal is stability, not sudden advantage. Unofficially, those who learn of changes early can act quietly, altering the coins they hold, the rates they offer trusted clients, or the terms of letters of exchange they issue. Done discreetly, such moves can yield handsome profits before the rest of the market catches on. The tension between collective stability and individual gain runs deep in the Art del Cambio. The Capitali dell'Arte are written in clear, formal language, but behind each rule lies a history of negotiation, compromise, and the occasional scandal. Senior members remember times when Siena's reputation was nearly ruined by one man's greed or saved by another's quick action in defiance of the rules. These stories are passed on to apprentices not just as cautionary tales, but as unspoken lessons. Sometimes, survival means knowing when to step beyond the line. This unspoken code is perhaps most visible in the alliances that form within the guild. A money changer with partners in Florence and Pisa can move funds across borders with far greater speed than one who operates alone. Such partnerships are officially sanctioned when properly recorded, but in practice, much of the coordination happens through private correspondence and personal visits. A merchant might receive a better rate in Siena because of a deal struck in Florence 2 weeks earlier, a deal the guild will never see in its ledgers. Of course, alliances have their costs. Favor one partner too openly, and others may withdraw their trust. Push the rules too far, and an inspector might be encouraged to look more closely at your books. The fines are steep, but the greater danger is the loss of standing within the art del cambio. A guild member who loses the confidence of his peers can find himself isolated, his bench still open, but his business dwindling as clients drift elsewhere. For all the risks, the quiet bending of rules continues because the rewards can be significant. One winter, a handful of members arranged to buy up worn Venetian ducats at a discount, then melt them down and have the gold recast into florins by a cooperative goldsmith. The practice skirted the edges of legality but was never formally challenged. By spring, the profit had been made and the coins had been reabsorbed into circulation. In these moments, you see how Siena's economic life is shaped as much by the personalities of its money changers as by the statutes of the guild. Some are cautious, preferring the steady income of small, rule-bound trades. Others are bold, willing to risk the ire of the guild for a chance at greater gain. Most fall somewhere in between, bending when necessary but keeping one eye on the line they must not cross. The guild, for its part, walks its own line. Too much leniency, and its authority erodes. Too much rigidity, and business slips away to rival cities. Its leaders know that the art del cambio survives not because it eliminates every infraction, but because it maintains the appearance of order while allowing enough flexibility for profit to flow. It is a balance as delicate as the weighing of a gold coin on a windy day. Tonight, the senior member folds the letter from Genoa and slips it into a locked drawer. Tomorrow, he will act on its information, quietly adjusting the rates he offers to certain clients. He will not speak of it at the next guild meeting, and the ledger will record the transactions without explanation. Weeks from now, when the rest of the market catches up, the opportunity will have passed, and the guild's posted rates will adjust as if by natural tide. Walking home through the dimly lit streets, you think about the benches in the Piazza del Campo. By day, they are symbols of order, each scale and weight certified, each rate posted for all to see. But beneath that order runs a current of private calculation, a quiet acknowledgement that the lifeblood of trade is not the rules themselves, but the men who know how to work around them. And you wonder, in the long run, will it be the coin in the scales or the letter folded in a drawer that shapes the fate of Siena's money changers? Story 6. Ink, Wax, and the Ledger's Whisper. The smell of ink in a medieval counting room is unlike any other. It is heavy and metallic, laced with the faint tang of vinegar from the iron gall formula, and it clings to the air even after the day's work is done. In a narrow back room off a shop in Florence, a single candle sputters, casting shadows that stretch over the open pages of a ledger. The candle is expensive beeswax, not tallow, its steady burn a silent marker of the merchant's standing. This is the domain of a man who does not deal in silks or spices, at least not directly. His trade is numbers, his tools quills and parchment. The merchant's name, written in a fine cursive at the top of the ledger, belongs to one of Florence's growing class of professional bookkeepers, men who turn the chaos of trade into the ordered columns of debellentry accounting. The system is not new in its essentials. Merchants have long kept accounts of what they owed and what was owed to them. But here, in Florence, the method has been refined into something systematic, almost mechanical. For every transaction there are two entries, one recording the credit, the other the debit. Together, they balance, forming a complete picture that allows a merchant to know not just what he has today, but what he will have tomorrow and what he owes in between. To outsiders, the ledger's columns are cryptic, the headings obscure: per cassa for cash on hand, per merci for goods in stock, per debitory for those who owe the merchant, per creditory for those to whom he owes. In a time before calculators, every sum is checked by hand, each page a careful lattice of numbers, abbreviations, and marginal notes. Accuracy is everything, An error in one column will ripple through the accounts, throwing the books out of balance. The merchant works with the discipline of a craftsman. Coins change hands in the front room, but the real work is here in the back, where each sale, each purchase, each loan is transformed into ink and parchment. A consignment of wool from England arrives in the port of Pisa. It is entered twice, once as an increase in stock, once as an increase in debt to the supplier. A payment from a debtor in Genoa, recorded as a reduction in what is owed to the merchant, matched by an increase in his cash. It is a system that demands constant attention. The merchant keeps not one ledger but three: the giorno, where transactions are recorded as they happen; the memorial, a rougher record for notes and agreements; and the libro mastro, the master ledger, where the final, balanced entries are written in a neat hand. By the time an entry reaches the libro mastro, it has been checked and rechecked, its figures verified against receipts and letters. This is not glamorous work, but it is indispensable. In the volatile world of medieval trade, where fortunes can shift with the weather or the health of a distant ruler, a well-kept set of books is a shield against disaster. A merchant who knows exactly what is owed to him and what he owes can see trouble coming before it arrives, or seize an opportunity without overreaching. Florence's merchant class has embraced the double entry method with enthusiasm. The city is a web of obligations, merchants financing voyages, goldsmiths lending to traders, bankers investing in distant ventures, and the clarity of this system allows these webs to stretch without tearing. It also allows for a kind of trust that goes beyond personal acquaintance. A merchant in Bruges may never meet his Florentine partner in person, but if both keep their books by the same method, they can understand one another's accounts at a glance. And yet, for all its precision, the ledger is not immune to manipulation. The same system that reveals the truth can also conceal it if one knows where to place the ink. A debt can be shifted from one account to another, an expense delayed in recording, a profit taken early. Such adjustments may be harmless, smoothing the books to match the rhythm of payments, or they may be deliberate deceptions. The line between the two is thin, and in the glow of a single candle, it can disappear entirely. Tonight, the merchant works alone. His assistant has gone home, and the street outside is quiet. The candle's light falls on an entry made earlier in the day, a payment received for a shipment of alum, recorded properly in the giorno but not yet copied into the libro mastro. He pauses, quill poised, considering. The funds could be shown as received today, improving the month's balance, or as arriving tomorrow to offset a debt due in the morning. Either choice is defensible, but each tells a different story to anyone who might read the ledger. In the stillness, the merchant dips his quill in the ink pot and makes his choice. The ledger whispers under his hand, the scratch of the quill a sound as much a part of Florence's trade as the clink of coin in the market. And you can't help but wonder, in a city that prides itself on the balance of its books, how much of that balance is truth and how much is the art of telling the right story at the right time. Morning in Florence begins not with bells, but with shutters opening. The counting room is bright now, and the careful shadows of last night's candlelight are gone. The merchant sits again at his ledger, this time with his assistant beside him, a young man with ink on his fingers and a sharp memory for numbers. The giornal is spread open, and the merchant is dictating yesterday's transactions for copying into the libro mastro. Double entry accounting is as much ritual as method. The assistant reads each figure aloud before writing it, the merchant nodding with approval or making small corrections. The columns are neat, the headings consistent. The process has the rhythm of a chant: debit here, credit there, each matched and balanced. To the apprentice, it is a discipline. To the merchant, it is protection. These pages are the proof of his solvency, his shield against disputes and accusations. But behind this precision lies a layer of quiet discretion. Not all transactions are written with equal clarity. For debts that might cause embarrassment if too visible, vague descriptors are used per affaire privato, for private business. The kind of entry that will not draw attention unless someone is looking very closely. The merchant has learned that even in honest trade, appearances matter almost as much as the truth. A partner who sees too much risk in your accounts may withdraw before trouble actually arrives. One such discreet entry concerns a client in Venice, a wool merchant who has borrowed heavily this year. The debt is still being serviced, but slowly, and the merchant in Florence suspects that his Venetian counterpart is overextended. Rather than note the arrears too plainly, he shifts the record marking payments as advances on future shipments rather than as overdue debts. It is a fiction of sorts, but one that buys time for both parties. In the broader world of Florentine commerce, such shadow adjustments are common. The city thrives on long-distance trade, and with voyages taking months and news traveling slowly, uncertainty is inevitable. A payment may be on its way, a shipment already loaded, but until the goods arrive, the ledger must still reflect the gap. Adjusting the presentation of those gaps is part of the art of maintaining confidence. This is why, for all its mathematical appearance, double-entry bookkeeping is not a science but a language. It allows merchants to speak in figures, but also to shade meaning, to choose which story the numbers tell. A skilled bookkeeper can present the same set of facts in ways that make a business seem thriving or struggling, solvent or fragile. To the untrained eye, the balance sheet is truth. To those within the trade, it is one version of truth among many. The guilds of Florence understand this flexibility. They require that accounts be kept, and that disputes be settled by reference to those accounts, but they rarely demand to see every ledger in detail. It is enough that the books exist and that they can be produced if needed. In practice, this means the ledgers serve as both shield and sword. They protect a merchant from false claims, but can also be used to press an advantage in negotiation. At midday, the merchant receives a visitor, a banker from Siena with whom he shares a long-standing arrangement. They speak in the front room at first, exchanging pleasantries and discussing the weather, the latest prices for wool, and the arrival of a Genoese ship in Pisa. Only after this does the conversation turn to numbers. A payment is due from a third party, one that both men have reason to doubt will arrive in full. The banker proposes a quiet adjustment. The debt will be split, recorded differently in each set of books, so that neither appears to be carrying the full risk. Such arrangements are the unseen threads that hold Florence's commercial web together. The city's economy depends on trust, but trust is rarely blind. It is built on a shared understanding of what can be shown and what must remain between the lines. By late afternoon, the merchant returns to his ledger. He enters the day's smaller transactions: a purchase of wax for candles, the sale of a small quantity of alum, the settlement of a debt from a local tanner. These are straightforward, the kind of entries that require no finesse. But in the margins, he adds a note in a private shorthand, marking the arrangement with the Sienese banker. It will never appear in the official copy of the Libro Mastro, but he will remember it when the time comes to settle accounts. The sun sets and the counting room grows dim again. This time 2 candles are lit. The assistant has gone home, leaving the merchant alone with the quiet scratching of his quill. On the page before him, columns of figures march in perfect order, each debit matched by a credit. It is a picture of balance, of stability, of trustworthiness. And yet, you can see how the ledger is as much a work of composition as of calculation. It is not a mirror of reality, but a portrait one painted in ink and numbers, designed to be read in a particular light. And you might ask yourself, in a world where numbers can be arranged to tell many stories, is the most valuable skill in trade the ability to keep the books or to write them so that they are believed? The counting room smells of warm wax and dry parchment. Outside, Florence's restless voices in the street, the rumble of cart wheels over cobblestones, the faint clanging of the bells from the Palazzo Vecchio marking the hour. Inside, the merchant leans over his ledger, the quill's tip scratching in a steady rhythm. This is the last work of the day, but also the most important. On the desk lie 3 books: the Giornale, the rough log of daily dealings; the Memorial, where letters, contracts, and verbal agreements are summarized; and the libro mastro, the polished record that will outlast the merchant himself. These books will be the proof of his dealings when he is gone, not just to heirs and partners, but to the city's notaries, guild officials, and perhaps even to hostile creditors. In Florence, the ledger is more than a tool. It is a legal and moral document, a statement of the merchant's identity. But identity in commerce is not only about honesty, it is about perception. The merchant knows that the neat columns and balanced accounts must inspire confidence, even if they do not tell the whole story. A small gap here, an advance payment booked as next month's income, a debt quietly shifted to another page, these are not, in his mind, lies. They are the shaping of truth into a form the market will accept. Tonight, he is reviewing a complex transaction with a banking house in Lucca. The payment terms are unusual, half in coin, half in bills of exchange payable over 6 months. The bills are good. The Lucca bankers have a reputation for reliability, but the timing will leave the merchant's cash reserves low for several weeks. In the ledger, he chooses to record the bills as if they were already equivalent to coin, improving his present balance. It is a fiction that could backfire if anyone demanded immediate settlement, but it is unlikely, and in the meantime, it keeps the appearance of solvency intact. As he writes, the candle gutters. The light wavers over the neat black ink, making the letters dance. In the shadows beyond the desk, stacks of correspondence wait, letters from Bruges, Pisa, Barcelona. Each one is part of a larger network of obligations and promises, and each has its place in the books. The merchant will answer them tomorrow. For now, the task is to close this page, to finish the day with the numbers in harmony. Florence's merchant culture thrives on this harmony. The double entry system is not merely a way to keep track of money, it is a philosophy of balance. Every gain must be matched by a loss somewhere, every credit by a debit. It is a worldview as much as a method, the belief that all things can be made to align, if only one is patient and careful enough with the ink. The merchant thinks about his rivals. Some keep their books poorly, relying on memory and loose notes. Others keep them so tightly that no adjustment is possible, every entry fixed, every figure rigid. He believes both extremes are dangerous. Flexibility within the discipline of the system, that is the way to survive. The ledger is not a chain, it is a net, and a skilled hand can tighten or loosen it as needed. The last entry of the night is small, a purchase of parchment from a local stationer. It is paid in coin, recorded promptly and balanced with a credit to the cash account. There is no art here, no adjustment, just the honest reflection of a simple trade. He blots the ink, closes the book, and places it carefully on the shelf where it will rest until morning. As the candle burns low, the merchant sits for a moment, listening to the quiet. The ledger is closed, but the work is never done. Tomorrow there will be new entries, new choices, new chances to tell the story of his business in the way that serves it best. And you might wonder, as the candle's flame shrinks to a pinprick and then dies, in the centuries to come, when some archivist opens these pages in the half-light of an archive, will they read them as truth or as a story told by a master in the art of shadows and ink? Story 7. The Ledger of Salt. Salt does not seem like a thing that needs a ledger. It is white, crystalline, ordinary. You sprinkle it on food, throw it into a vat of hides, scatter it across a fish before drying. And yet, in the medieval world, salt is money, and because it is money, it demands careful accounting. In the 14th century, Florence is not a salt-producing city. The nearest salt pans lie along the coast, in places like Servia and Chioggia, where seawater is trapped in shallow basins and left for the sun to do its work. The salt crystals that form are scraped up with wooden rakes, dried and packed into sacks. From there, the sacks travel by cart or by barge, making their way inland to the cities that will pay dearly for them. Salt's value comes from necessity. Without it, food spoils quickly, especially in summer. Meat must be salted to survive long journeys. Fish caught in distant waters must be preserved before reaching the market. In Florence, the tanners rely on salt to cure hides, and the dyers use it in their vats. Even the city's bakers, though they use little, cannot work without it. A shortage of salt is not an inconvenience, it is a crisis. This is why the salt trade is tightly regulated, and why merchants keep such precise records. A single sack miscounted can mean lost profit, unpaid debt, or accusations of fraud. The city's officials keep their own accounts, tracking every shipment that enters and every tax paid. But private merchants keep parallel records ledgers that detail the origin, quantity, and sale of each load. In a warehouse near the Porta al Prato, a salt merchant works at a high wooden desk. His ledger is open to a page headed per sali di Servia, for salts of Servia. Beneath the heading, neat columns list the sacks received, their weight, the price per sack, and the name of the supplier. Beside these, another column records the sacks sold and to whom: a tanner on the Via della Scala, a fishmonger at the Mercato Vecchio, a baker whose name appears so often that it must be for the city's public ovens. The merchant's handwriting is steady, but the margins are crowded with notes. A shipment delayed by rain, a cart overturned on the road, a dispute over the purity of a batch. Salt varies in quality, and a sack contaminated with too much grit or clay can bring complaints or demands for a lower price. These disputes are not resolved in court, but in the ledger. If the books show a pattern of overcharging or underweight sacks, the merchant's reputation will suffer. And in Florence, reputation is as valuable as coin. Salt also has a way of vanishing. A sack split in transit, a handful scooped out by a porter, a dishonest customer undermeasuring at the scales. The losses are small individually, but over a season they add up. This is why the ledger includes not only the quantity received and sold, but the quantity lost. Perdite losses have their own column. It is never large, but it is always there, a reminder that even in trade, some part of the stock will slip through your fingers. In the evening, after the last sale is recorded, the merchant sits back and studies the totals. Salt's value does not lie only in what he has sold today, but in the rhythm of the trade across the year. Demand rises in late spring, when meat must be preserved for the warmer months, and again in autumn, when fish from the Adriatic comes into season. By keeping careful accounts, he can plan his purchases, buying more in the months when prices are low and holding back stock for when they will rise. Salt is not a glamorous trade, but it is steady. A silk merchant may see his fortune double with a single shipment or lose it all if the ship sinks. A salt merchant rarely sees such drama. His profit is built in layers, sack by sack, recorded in columns of ink that grow slowly but steadily. And yet, as the candle burns low and the merchant closes his ledger, you might wonder, in a trade where every grain counts, how much of the ledger's neat balance comes from skill, and how much from the quiet art of making the numbers match the story you need to tell. By the time the sun rises over Florence, the salt merchant's day is already shaped by decisions made weeks earlier. Salt does not arrive daily like vegetables in the market. It comes in shipments, measured in cartloads, negotiated long before the first wheel turns on the road from the coast. These arrangements are as much about relationships as they are about price. The merchant's connection to Servia's salt pans is maintained through letters and couriers. A single sheet of parchment can carry an order worth a month's trade, but its wording must be exact. Quantità is clear enough the number of sacks, but qualità requires diplomacy. Too blunt a demand for higher purity risks offending the supplier. Too vague, and you may receive the bottom of the heap. The merchant has learned to phrase his requests as shared concerns. As we agreed last year, your best grade for my Florence customers who remember its excellence. These words, when copied into the merchant's letter register, are as much a part of his accounts as the numbers in his ledger. The correspondence builds a paper trail that can defend him if a dispute reaches the guild or the courts. In the salt trade, where taxes and monopolies are in constant tension, such proof is worth more than memory. Florence's salt market is under the watchful eye of the Ufficio del Sale, the salt office, a civic authority tasked with collecting duties and preventing smuggling. The tax is not light, and evasion is tempting. A load of salt brought into the city without being declared can fetch a much higher profit, but if discovered, the fine can ruin a merchant. This is why the ledger shows not only purchases and sales, but taxes paid. These entries are written in a different ink, red for visibility, so that any inspector can see the merchant's compliance. Of course, compliance is not always as strict as it looks. The merchant knows of colleagues who lose a sack or two in transit, recording them as damaged and thus untaxed, only to sell them quietly to trusted customers. He does not do this himself, or so he would say, but he knows the arithmetic, and it would be easy enough to make the numbers work. Losses, genuine or otherwise, are part of the language of the ledger. In a year of heavy rain, when the road from the coast is muddy and carts overturn more often, perdite entries grow. In a year of political tension, when a neighboring city blocks the salt trade for weeks, the losses may be recorded as delays or unfulfilled orders instead. The words chosen matter as much as the numbers. They can suggest misfortune without fault, keeping the merchant's reputation intact. The salt pans themselves are a world away from Florence's counting rooms. In Servia, workers labor barefoot in shallow pools, raking the crystals as the sun bakes the water away. The work is seasonal, timed to the heat, and the output depends entirely on the weather. A cloudy week in July can mean smaller crystals and lower yields, news that may not reach Florence until the shipment arrives. This is why merchants hedge their supply, arranging for deliveries from multiple sources, and keeping enough in storage to ride out a bad season. Storage brings its own problems. Salt draws moisture from the air, and in a damp warehouse, sacks can clump into hard blocks, harder to measure and less attractive to buyers. The merchant notes in his ledger which sacks have been stored the longest, marking them for sale before the fresh stock. The magazzino, the warehouse, has its own set of accounts, tracking the movement of goods in and out, each tied back to the main ledger. The customers are just as varied as the sources. The tanner cares about quantity and price, not appearance. The fishmonger demands purity, since even a hint of grit will spoil his trade. The baker buys in small amounts, but buys often, his entries filling the ledger with steady, low-value sales that keep the cash flow moving. Each of these relationships is recorded in its own way, some with precise weights and prices, others with more flexible tallies, settled monthly or quarterly. And so the merchant's day moves between the physical reality of the sacks counted, stacked, sometimes broken, and the paper reality of the ledger. One is heavy, coarse, and salty to the touch. The other is smooth parchment and the measured scratch of ink. The art of the trade lies in making these two realities align, or at least appear to align, even when the road is muddy, the sacks imperfect, and the customers impatient. By evening, the ledger page is nearly full. The day's entries are balanced, the totals checked. A few lines in the margin note letters to be sent tomorrow, payments expected next week. The merchant closes the book with the quiet satisfaction of order restored. But as the candle flickers, he wonders, and you might too, whether the true measure of his business lies in the weight of the sacks in the warehouse, or in the weight of the numbers written so neatly on the page. In the merchant's warehouse, the air smells faintly of brine. The sacks are stacked in neat rows, each one marked with a faded symbol, sometimes the supplier's brand, sometimes a simple cross or letter to help the porter remember which batch is which. In theory, these marks match the entries in the ledger exactly. In practice, the marks can fade, sacks can be shifted, and the careful order imagined in the counting room can slip when the workmen hurry or the day grows long. The merchant knows this, and so his visits to the warehouse are as much about control as about stock-taking. With a hand on the rough cloth of the sacks, he measures their weight by feel. A sack lightened by even a small handful is noticeable if you know what to expect. The porters swear their honesty, but the merchant keeps the habit of noting any suspicious difference in a small pocket notebook, separate from the official records. This notebook will never be shown to an inspector or a customer. It is for the merchant's own strategy, his quiet measure of trust. In the ledger, losses are reduced to a number in a column. In the warehouse, each loss is a moment. a split seam spilling white crystals into the dust, a porter scooping with his hands to fill a basket, a customer's boy waiting while the scales tilt in his favor. The merchant has learned to see these not as disasters, but as the invisible cost of doing business. No trade is without its seepage, and salt in its very nature is prone to it. Still, balance must be maintained. For every loss recorded, there must be a gain elsewhere. Sometimes that gain comes from a favorable bargain buying low in Servia when the season's yield is high. Sometimes it comes from holding stock through the winter, when prices creep upward in anticipation of spring demand. And sometimes it comes from what the ledger calls adjustment, a flexible entry that smooths over the gaps between what the warehouse holds and what the parchment claims it holds. These adjustments are small, almost invisible against the columns of numbers, but they are where the merchant's skill lies. A novice might panic at a missing sack, rushing to replace it and losing profit in the process. An experienced trader lets the numbers breathe, shifting a little here, a little there, until the books show exactly what they need to show. This is not fraud in his mind, but stewardship, the shaping of truth to keep the business alive. Florence's salt trade is stable, but not immune to danger. War can cut off the road from the coast. A failed harvest in another region can drive up demand and draw salt away from the city. Taxes can be raised with little warning, or new restrictions imposed by the Officio del Sale in response to rumors of smuggling. The merchant's ledger contains hints of these disruptions: sudden jumps in price, abrupt shortages, unexplained pauses in delivery. To the casual reader, they are just numbers. To one who knows the trade, they are the story of a city's appetite and the merchant's ability to feed it. In quieter years, the salt trade becomes almost meditative. The merchant's routine repeats: purchase, transport, storage, sale, record. The same customers appear at regular intervals, the same suppliers send their carts along the same roads. The ledger grows page by page, each one a mirror of the last, until months and years blend together in a calm pattern of transactions. It is in these stretches that the merchant feels most secure and most aware that this security can never last. One winter evening, as he reviews the year's accounts, he sees that his profits are modest but steady. Losses are low, thanks to careful handling in the warehouse. Taxes are paid in full, which keeps the city officials satisfied. There is enough cash on hand to purchase the spring shipment outright, avoiding the need for credit. These are the markers of a healthy trade, yet he knows they are as fragile as the thin crust on a salt pan before the harvest. The candle on his desk burns low, its light catching the grain of the parchment. He runs his finger down the final column, where the total balances perfectly, as it must, and closes the book. In the silence, he thinks of the sacks in the warehouse, the crystals within them, and the long journey each grain has made from the sea to this room. And you might ask yourself, as he leans back in his chair, whether the true wealth of the salt merchant lies in the weight of what he owns, or in the weight of the trust others place in the neat, balanced lines of his ledger. Story 8. The Bankers of Siena and the Quiet Collapse of 1346. In the spring of 1346, the streets of Siena bustled as they always had. Merchants called out their prices in the marketplace, wool carters worked their fleeces in narrow alleys, and the bells of the Torre del Mangia marked the hours above the Piazza del Campo. To the casual eye, nothing suggested that the city's great banking houses were approaching ruin. The Sienese banks had been among the most respected in Europe. For decades, houses like the Bonsignori and the Salimbeni had financed kings, popes, and merchants from England to the Levant. Their ledgers were full of loans to noble houses and vast trading companies, their vaults, at least in reputation, overflowing with silver and gold. But in reality, much of their wealth existed only as promises written in careful ink. The trouble began years earlier, not with a single disaster but with a slow accumulation of risk. The English crown, waging war against France, had borrowed heavily from Sienese bankers to fund armies and fleets. These loans were secured not in coin, but in future revenues from English wool exports, which the bankers would purchase at fixed prices and resell on the continental markets. For a time, the arrangement was profitable. English wool was prized in Italy and Flanders, and the bank's agents managed the trade with practiced skill. But war brings uncertainty. Shipments were delayed by storms or seized by enemies, and the flow of wool slowed. Worse, the crown's need for cash grew faster than its revenues. By the early 1340s, repayments began to falter. At first, the banks extended deadlines, confident that their royal debtor would recover. But each extension meant that more capital was locked in loans that yielded no immediate return. In the counting rooms of Siena, clerks kept the ledgers balanced with the practiced hand of men who understood the importance of appearances. A delayed payment was entered as pending, a partial delivery valued at full price. Columns of numbers still aligned neatly, but beneath the ink lay a growing whole one that could only be filled if the king resumed his payments in full. The signs were there for anyone who looked closely. The bankers' agents in Bruges reported that English wool shipments were smaller than promised. Letters from London hinted at political unrest and new taxes that would make repayment harder. In the piazza, rumors circulated that the Salimbeni had quietly mortgaged some of their own estates to raise cash. But in public, the bankers smiled, funded civic works, and continued to dress their counting rooms with open books and confident talk. Part of their confidence was real. Banking in the 14th century was as much about trust as about coin. A ledger filled with royal obligations was not worthless so long as others believed those obligations would eventually be honored. As long as depositors kept their funds in the banks, and as long as other merchants extended them credit, the houses of Siena could continue to operate, paying out withdrawals from incoming deposits while they waited for their great debts to be repaid. This balance, however, was delicate. A single shock, a war, a famine, a sudden loss of faith could unsettle it, and in 1346 the shock came from across the Channel. England, burdened by the cost of war, simply stopped payments to foreign creditors. The royal treasury claimed it could not meet its obligations without crippling the realm. The promises in the Sienese ledgers became paper with ink, and nothing more. The collapse did not happen in a single day. It unfolded quietly, almost politely, as if the bankers and their creditors wished to avoid admitting the truth. Withdrawals increased, new deposits slowed. The banks sold off assets, called in small loans, and delayed payments where they could. In the piazza, the faces of the great bankers grew strained, but they still appeared at public events, still signed letters with the elegant flourishes of prosperous men. And yet behind the facade, the truth was in the numbers. The ledgers, once fat with entries, began to show empty days, no new deposits, no major repayments. The margins, once filled with notes of future shipments and expected revenues, grew bare. The careful balance between perception and reality began to tilt, and the city's most respected houses found themselves counting not profits, but days until the coin ran out. It makes you wonder, in those final weeks, did the clerks who inked the ledgers know they were recording the last transactions of their house, or did they, like their masters, believe that a great name could survive a royal silence? In the weeks following England's suspension of payments, the counting rooms of Siena became places of quiet tension. The ledgers still lay open on the long wooden tables, quills still moved in practiced strokes, but the entries were thinner, now fewer transactions, fewer deposits, more adjustments in the margins. The clerks noticed first. They were the ones who tallied the incoming payments from merchants in Florence, Venice, and Bruges. They were the ones who saw that the sums were smaller than before, or delayed by a week, then two. They began to use more cautious ink, recording promised payments in a lighter hand, as if acknowledging the uncertainty without daring to speak it aloud. At the Salimbeni house, the chief cashier took to locking the coin vault each evening with a double turn of the key. The vault still held silver and gold, but it was no longer replenished at the rate it was withdrawn. Every payment to a depositor was a small but permanent loss, replaced not by new deposits, but by promises from clients who themselves were struggling to collect what was owed to them. To meet obligations, the banks began selling assets. Townhouses in Siena were quietly transferred to buyers willing to pay in coin. Shares in trading ventures were sold at a discount to Venetian and Genoese merchants. Even pieces of fine plate from the bankers' own tables found their way into the melting pots of goldsmiths. These sales were recorded in the ledgers under neutral terms liquidation. Transfer of property words that could just as easily belong to a strategic reallocation as to a desperate attempt to raise cash. In the piazza, business continued but with a different undercurrent. Depositors came not only to deposit but to test. They would request a small withdrawal, watch how quickly the teller produced the coin, and note whether the weight felt right in the hand. If the bank hesitated, word would spread. And in a business built entirely on trust, hesitation could be fatal. The bankers knew this, and for a time they managed the appearance of plenty. Larger withdrawals were delayed with polite excuses, a payment expected later in the week, a shipment of coin from Florence due tomorrow. Customers who accepted these delays were rewarded with quiet favors, better exchange rates, leniency on debts. But those who pressed too hard, too often, risked being told that their funds were temporarily unavailable, a phrase that in the language of banking meant nothing but trouble. The collapse was slow enough that many in Siena did not feel it directly. Wool carters still worked their trade, bakers still kneaded their bread, builders still laid bricks for new houses. The city's economy was not yet in open crisis, but among merchants and financiers the strain was unmistakable. Credit, once extended on a handshake and a word, now required guarantees. Loans were smaller, terms shorter. Some ventures stalled entirely for lack of financing. Letters from London confirmed the worst. The English crown intended no immediate repayment. Other foreign clients, fearing the same, began moving their business to rival banks in Florence, Venice, and Genoa. Siena's bankers were left with a dwindling circle of customers and a growing pile of obligations they could not meet. Inside the Salimbeni counting room, the great ledger for the year 1346 told the story in its own silent way. Early pages, written in bold hand, showed the regular flow of business deposits, loans, repayments, investments. Midway through, the entries thinned, the handwriting grew tighter, and the margins filled with cautious notes about delays, negotiations, and adjustments. By the final months, entire weeks passed with no significant transactions recorded. And still, the bankers tried to maintain the fiction. A closed bank was an admission of failure, and failure could tarnish a family's name for generations. As long as the doors remained open and the clerks kept writing, there was at least the appearance of continuity. Yet the numbers, for anyone who knew how to read them, told another truth. The great houses of Siena were surviving on ink alone. You might wonder, as the clerks surely did, whether it was loyalty or fear that kept them writing entries they knew could never be balanced with coin. Was it devotion to the families they served, or simply the hope that if they wrote long enough, some miracle payment would arrive to make the columns right again? By the winter of 1346, the banking houses of Siena no longer needed a proclamation to announce their decline. The truth had already seeped into the city like water through the cracks of an old cistern. The once crowded counting rooms had thinned. Some desks sat empty, the clerks dismissed to save wages. Those who remained moved with deliberate slowness, stretching each day's work so that the silence between transactions did not seem quite so wide. The Salimbeni, the largest and most storied of Siena's banking dynasties, kept their facade longer than most. They continued to host dignitaries in their palazzo, still offered wine and spiced wafers to favored clients, still dressed their senior partners in fine wool and fur when they appeared in the piazza. But behind the brocade curtains of the meeting rooms, discussions turned from profit to survival. Liquid assets had dwindled to almost nothing. What coin remained in the vault was already earmarked for withdrawals promised days or weeks before. Real estate sales no longer fetched good prices. Potential buyers knew the banks were desperate, and they bid accordingly. Even the most respected creditors had begun to refuse their bills of exchange, preferring instead to deal with Florentine or Venetian houses that still seemed secure. For the bankers themselves, there was no dramatic moment of collapse. There was only the gradual realization that they had crossed an invisible line, the point at which the effort to appear solvent consumed more energy than the effort to actually conduct business. The ledgers still lay open, but the pages recorded more adjustments than actual trade. In early 1347, one of the smaller houses closed its doors without notice. Depositors arrived to find the shutters drawn and the street outside strangely quiet. Rumors spread quickly. Other banks saw lines forming at their doors as nervous clients demanded withdrawals. The Salimbeni weathered that first rush, but it cost them dearly. Silver bars sold at a loss, gold plate melted, loans recalled at unfavorable terms. The following months brought more closures. Each time a house fell, confidence in the survivors diminished. By summer, the Salimbeni themselves faced the inevitable. One morning, the doors remained closed. An official notice from the city's magistrates declared the bank insolvent, its assets seized to satisfy creditors. The same fate soon befell the other great Sienese houses. The collapse sent ripples far beyond Siena. In England, merchants who had relied on Sienese financing found themselves without capital. In Flanders, clothmakers lost access to the steady flow of English wool once managed through the bank's networks. Even the papal court in Avignon felt the loss, as the Sienese had long managed certain church revenues and payments. In Siena itself, the impact was uneven. Wealthy merchants who had diversified their holdings survived, though often with reduced fortunes. Artisans and laborers, less directly tied to the banks, continued their work much as before. But the city's political power, long tied to the prestige of its bankers, suffered a permanent blow. The ledgers that remain from those years tell a story that is both precise and incomplete. They record the transactions, the dates, the amounts. They do not record the conversations in the counting rooms, the sleepless nights of the partners, the quiet dread of the clerks who knew they were witnessing the end of something grand. They cannot capture the moment when a banker, alone at his desk, stared at a page and realized that the neat columns no longer described a business, but a memory. And perhaps that is the final lesson of Siena's collapse, that a bank's strength is not simply measured in coin or credit, but in the faith others place in the words written in its books. Once that faith falters, even the most careful ledger becomes only ink on parchment, and the silence of a shuttered counting room is the last entry of all.